The fluorescent lights of the basement supply room flickered twice before settling into their familiar hum, casting pale shadows across the concrete walls that smelled of bleach and floor wax and decades of accumulated silence. Daniel Hayes stood before the small metal locker that bore no name, only the number 147 stamped into a brass plate that had long ago lost its shine, and he changed into the navy blue uniform that had become his second skin over these past 3 years. The fabric was soft from countless washings, the Sterling Financial Group logo on the breast pocket faded to the point where only someone looking closely would recognize it, and as he buttoned the shirt with hands that had once typed complex algorithms on Bloomberg terminals worth more than this entire room, he caught his reflection in the scratched mirror mounted on the inside of the locker door. 38 years old. The face staring back at him belonged to a man who had learned to carry weariness like a coat that could never be removed. Not the weariness of physical labor, but something deeper. Something that had taken root in the marrow of his bones on a November night 3 years ago when the phone rang and the voice on the other end told him that his wife had collapsed at work, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. The eyes were still sharp despite everything, still capable of reading market trends and spotting numerical discrepancies with the same precision that had once made millionaires nervous. But there was something else in them now, a quality that Catherine used to call his quiet strength and that his mother called the Hayes stubbornness, and that he himself had come to recognize as nothing more complicated than the refusal to let the world break him completely. He closed the locker and picked up the mop and bucket that waited for him in the corner, the tools of a trade he had never imagined practicing, and walked toward the service elevator that would carry him up 48 floors to the executive level, where men and women who had once been his colleagues made decisions worth more than he would earn in a lifetime. The elevator rose with a mechanical groan, and Daniel leaned against the back wall, letting his mind drift to the morning routine he had completed just hours ago. Sophie had needed help with her math homework before school fractions that seemed to confuse her in the way that numbers never confused him, and he had sat at their small kitchen table in the Queen's apartment and watched her tongue stick out slightly as she concentrated the same way Catherine's had when she was grading papers late into the night. 7 years old now, his daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin and eyes that still held the belief that the world was fundamentally kind. He worked to keep that belief alive, even as he scrubbed toilets for the kind of people who had destroyed his career without a second thought. The elevator doors opened onto the 48th floor, and Danielle stepped out into a corridor of glass and marble and the particular silence that only vast amounts of money can buy. The executive offices of Sterling Financial Group occupied the top 3 floors of a tower that commanded prime Wall Street real estate, a monument to wealth and power that his former self would have coveted and his current self saw with different eyes entirely. He had learned in these 3 years of invisibility that there was a certain freedom in being overlooked, a clarity that came from watching the powerful from the shadows they never bothered to examine. The main conference room door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Daniel could hear a voice cutting through the air with the precision of a surgical blade. He knew that voice. Everyone who worked in this building knew that voice. Victoria Sterling, CEO, 33 years old, beautiful in the way that marble statues are beautiful, had inherited this company 5 years ago when her father died of a sudden heart attack, and she had spent every day since proving that she was more than Gregory Sterling's daughter. The business press called her brilliant. Her employees called her ice. She called herself necessary, though Daniel suspected that was a defense mechanism rather than a genuine self-assessment. He positioned himself near the windows at the far end of the corridor, beginning the methodical work of cleaning glass that was already spotless, and through the conference room's transparent walls, he could see the tableau unfolding inside. 12 people sat around a table that cost more than his annual salary, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from fear to resignation, and at the head of that table stood Victoria Sterling, in a black suit that probably cost more than 3 months of his rent, her posture radiating the kind of controlled fury that made subordinates wish they had called in sick. She was holding a thick document in one hand, and as Daniel watched, she threw it onto the table with enough force to make the man nearest to her flinch visibly. Her words carried through the glass, muffled but intelligible. "You call this a quarterly analysis? I've paid more for coffee that showed better judgment than this report demonstrates." The man who appeared to be the head of the analytical team, a silver-haired executive whose name Daniel vaguely remembered as Sullivan, attempted to respond his mouth-forming words about methodology and market conditions and factors beyond their control. Victoria cut him off with a gesture that needed no translation. "I don't pay you for excuses, Mark. I pay you for accuracy. And what I'm seeing here suggests that either you don't understand basic financial modeling or you think I'm too stupid to notice when the numbers don't add up." Daniel continued his work, moving his cloth across the window glass in slow, methodical strokes, but his attention remained fixed on the scene inside the conference room. Old habits died hard, and even after 3 years of exile from the world of high finance, he couldn't help but analyze what he was seeing. The document Victoria had thrown onto the table was visible from his angle, a spreadsheet of projected earnings with columns of figures that his trained eye could read even at this distance. And there it was, a mistake so fundamental that he would have caught it in his first week at Wharton, hiding in plain sight among the professional formatting and the expensive paper. The formula in column J was calculating compound growth on simple interest rates, a basic error that would cascade through every subsequent projection and result in losses that these people clearly hadn't anticipated. He shook his head slightly, an involuntary response to mathematical incompetence, and in doing so made the mistake of catching Victoria Sterling's eye through the glass. She stopped mid-sentence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. And then she was moving toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor, with the sharp rhythm of approaching judgment, and Daniel found himself standing very still, with a cleaning cloth in one hand, and the uncomfortable awareness that invisibility only works when you don't draw attention to yourself. The conference room door swung open. Victoria Sterling stepped into the corridor, and up close she was simultaneously more and less intimidating than she appeared from a distance. More because the intelligence in her eyes was sharper than any blade, the kind of mind that missed nothing and forgave even less. Less because beneath the armor of her perfectly tailored suit and her precisely controlled expression, Daniel could see something he recognized from his own mirror, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for too long. Her voice when she spoke carried the same cutting precision it had inside the conference room, but there was something else underneath it now, a note of genuine curiosity that her employees probably never heard. "You know finance?" It was not really a question. She had seen him shake his head. She had watched him read the document through the glass. And she was the kind of person who noticed everything and connected the dots faster than most people could identify that there were dots to connect. Daniel met her gaze without flinching, and in that moment he made a decision that would alter everything that came after. He could have deflected. He could have played dumb, claiming he was shaking his head at something else entirely, retreated back into the comfortable anonymity of his position. But Catherine had always said he was constitutionally incapable of watching someone make a mistake without pointing it out. And 3 years of scrubbing floors for people who had once been his peers had not changed that fundamental aspect of his character. Enough to know, he said, his voice steady and clear, that you're about to lose $18 million on a 0.3% miscalculation in your compound interest formula. The silence that followed stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. Through the glass, Daniel could see the faces of the executives inside the conference room, frozen in expressions of shock and outrage that a janitor would dare to speak to their CEO about financial matters. Victoria Sterling's face remained unreadable, but something shifted in her eyes. A calculation that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with reassessing the man standing before her in a faded uniform holding a cleaning cloth. "Column J," Daniel continued, because he had already crossed the line and there was no point in half measures. "Your team is mixing simple and compound interest rates. The error propagates through every subsequent projection. If you proceed with the European market strategy based on these figures, you'll be underwater by the end of the first fiscal quarter." Victoria turned and walked back into the conference room without another word. Daniel watched through the glass as she said something to the silver-haired executive, watched the man's face cycle through disbelief and anger, and finally, as he checked the formula himself, a sickly shade of pale that confirmed what Daniel had seen from 50 feet away through a window. When she emerged again, the conference room behind her was in chaos, voices raised in accusation and defense, but Victoria Sterling moved through it like a ship through storm waves, untouched by the turbulence she left in her wake. She stopped in front of Daniel, and this time her expression was different. The cold authority was still there, the armor that had kept her alive in a world that wanted to see her fail, but there was also something that looked almost like respect. "What's your name?" "Daniel Hayes." "How long have you worked here, Mr. Hayes?" 3 years, night shift custodial." She studied him for a long moment, and Daniel had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen in a way that he had carefully avoided for 36 months. This woman missed nothing. She would look into his background. She would find out who he had been before he became a man in a blue uniform cleaning floors in the building where dreams of financial success came to either flourish or die. "I'll be reviewing your personnel file," she said finally. "I suggest you make yourself available for a conversation tomorrow evening. 7 o'clock, my office." She turned and walked back into the conference room, and Daniel was left standing in the corridor with a cleaning cloth in his hand and the distinct feeling that he had just set something in motion that could not be easily stopped. The Q train rattled through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, carrying Daniel Hayes away from the gleaming towers of Wall Street toward the very different landscape of Queens. The car was half empty at this hour, the late-night riders, consisting mostly of nurses ending their shifts and cleaning staff heading home, and the occasional drunk whose head lolled against the window with each sway of the train. Daniel sat in a corner seat, his work uniform hidden beneath a jacket that had seen better days, and watched the darkness outside the window while his mind replayed the events of the evening. He had been invisible for 3 years. 3 years of careful anonymity, of keeping his head down and doing his job, and refusing to engage with the world that had chewed him up and spit him out. And in the space of 5 minutes, he had thrown all of that away because he couldn't keep his mouth shut about a basic mathematical error. Catherine would have laughed. She had always said that his relationship with numbers bordered on the pathological, that he noticed computational mistakes the way other people notice spelling errors in restaurant menus, with an involuntary wince that he couldn't suppress, no matter how hard he tried. She would have told him that some things were worth the risk of exposure, that a man who stops speaking truth because it might be inconvenient is a man who has lost something essential about himself. But Catherine was dead, and Daniel was left to make these decisions alone, weighing the potential consequences of his actions against the memory of who she had believed he could be. The train emerged from the tunnel into the elevated section of the line, and through the window, Daniel could see the familiar streets of his neighborhood, passing by the bodegas with their neon signs, and the laundromats that stayed open until midnight, and the apartments stacked above small businesses where families had lived for generations. This was not the New York of glossy magazine spreads and tourist photographs. This was the New York where people worked 2 jobs and worried about rent and raised children who deserved better than the world seemed willing to give them. His stop came, and Daniel stepped off the train onto a platform that smelled of rain and exhaust and the particular ozone scent of the subway system. The stairs down to street level were lit by flickering bulbs that the MTA never seemed to replace, and he navigated them with the automatic familiarity of 3 years of the same route, the same schedule, the same careful balance between work and family that left no room for anything that resembled a personal life. The apartment building where he lived was 6 stories of faded brick and fire escapes that looked like they hadn't been inspected since the Clinton administration. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, each step creaking in its own particular way, and let himself into the apartment where his daughter waited with homework and stories about school and the unconditional love that was the only thing keeping him tethered to a world that had given him every reason to let go. Sophie was asleep on the couch, her math workbook open on her lap and a pencil still clutched in her small hand. 7 years old, with Catherine's dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, and the peaceful expression of a child who had not yet learned that the world could be cruel. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, remembering the tiny infant he had held in the hospital while Catherine laughed and cried and called him the most wonderful idiot she had ever married because he kept counting Sophie's fingers and toes as if there might be a mistake in the arithmetic. His mother emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel and fixing him with the look that said she had been waiting up and wanted to know why he was later than usual. Margaret Hayes was 68 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of face that had weathered everything life had thrown at it and emerged with dignity intact. She had raised 3 children while working as a nurse, buried a husband who had spent 40 years on the Brooklyn docks, and moved into the apartment upstairs after Catherine died because someone needed to help with Sophie, and she would be damned if her granddaughter grew up without a woman's influence. "You're late," she said, and it was observation rather than accusation. Something happened at work. Good something or bad something. Daniel looked at his sleeping daughter at the math workbook, open to a page of fractions that had probably given her more trouble than she would admit, and considered how to answer a question that he wasn't sure he understood himself. "I don't know yet." Margaret Hayes had not survived 6 decades on this earth by pushing when pushing wouldn't help. She nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was, and tilted her head toward the kitchen, where Daniel could smell coffee that had probably been keeping warm for the past hour. "Sophie ate dinner. She wanted to wait up for you, but she fell asleep around 9 doing her math. I checked her work, but me and numbers." "Thanks, Mom." "I'm not doing it for thanks. I'm doing it because that little girl deserves someone looking out for her while her father works himself into an early grave." She paused in the kitchen doorway, studying his face with the particular attention of a mother who had learned to read her children's silences as fluently as their words. "Whatever happened tonight, Daniel, remember what I told you. Your father worked those docks for 40 years and never once hung his head. Because he did honest work and he did it well, and no man in a suit could take that away from him. I remember." "Good, because Hayes men don't break. We bend when we have to, but we don't break." She disappeared into the kitchen, and Daniel heard the sounds of her gathering her things to head upstairs to her own apartment. He crossed to the couch and carefully lifted Sophie, feeling the warm weight of her body against his chest as he carried her to the small bedroom they shared. She stirred slightly as he laid her on the bed, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "Dad, go back to sleep, sweetheart. Did you have a good day at work?" Daniel pulled the blanket up to her chin, tucking the edges the way Catherine used to do, and pressed a kiss to his daughter's forehead. "I had an interesting day at work." "What's the difference?" "Good days are predictable. Interesting days are the ones that might change everything." Sophie smiled sleepily, her eyes already closing again. "Mom used to say that interesting was better than good because it meant something was happening. Your mother was a very smart woman." "I know, I remember." And then she was asleep again, her breathing evening out into the rhythm that Daniel had memorized in the months after Catherine's death, when he would sit beside his daughter's bed for hours, terrified that if he looked away for even a moment, he might lose her too. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching his daughter sleep, and thought about what tomorrow would bring. Victoria Sterling would look into his background. She would find out about Wharton and Meridian Capital and the whistleblower case that had destroyed his career. She would discover that the janitor who had corrected her financial analysis was the same man who had once been on track to become one of the youngest managing directors in the history of one of New York's most prestigious investment firms. What she would do with that information, Daniel couldn't predict. But standing there in the darkness of a queen's apartment, with his daughter sleeping peacefully and his mother's footsteps fading on the stairs above, he made a decision that felt like the first true choice he had made in 3 years. He was done hiding. Whatever came next, he would face it in the way his father had faced 40 years of backbreaking work on the docks, the way Catherine had faced her illness in those final weeks, the way Margaret Hayes had faced the death of her husband and the destruction of her son's career. With dignity, with honesty, and with the quiet understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were stacked against you. The night passed slowly, as sleepless nights always do. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold hours ago, staring at the wall where Catherine had hung a photograph of the 3 of them at Coney Island. Sophie, just 2 years old and sticky with cotton candy and laughing at the waves. The photograph had been taken 6 months before Daniel discovered the fraud at Meridian Capital, 6 months before he made the decision that would cost him everything except his integrity. He remembered the exact moment he had first noticed the discrepancy. A Tuesday evening in September, working late because there was always more work to do, and because Catherine had taken Sophie to visit her parents in Connecticut, and the apartment felt too empty without them. He had been reviewing quarterly reports when a number caught his eye, a transfer to a subsidiary company that didn't quite match the corresponding entry in the parent company's books. A small discrepancy, barely noticeable, the kind of thing that could easily be written off as a clerical error. But Daniel Hayes did not write off numerical discrepancies. His mind worked the way a bloodhound's nose worked, following trails that others couldn't see until they led somewhere significant. He had pulled the thread, and the thread had unraveled into something monstrous. Hundreds of millions of dollars moving through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Client money, retirement funds, and college savings, and the accumulated wealth of people who trusted Meridian Capital to protect their futures, disappearing into offshore accounts that existed only on paper. The fraud was elegant in its construction, hidden beneath layers of legitimate transactions and legitimate-looking documentation, and Daniel understood immediately why no one else had caught it. You had to be looking. You had to care enough to look. And in the world of high finance, caring about where the money came from was often considered a liability rather than an asset. He had spent 3 months gathering evidence, carefully and methodically documenting every suspicious transaction and tracing every shell company to its source. He had done everything by the book, following the procedures he had been taught for exactly this situation, believing with the naive faith of the righteous that the system would protect him. The system had not protected him. The system had chewed him up and spit him out, and Catherine had paid the price for his integrity. Daniel closed his eyes against the memory of the phone call from her second job, the one she had taken to help make ends meet after the legal bills started piling up. A bakery that stayed open 24 hours, catering to the night owls and the early risers and the insomniacs who needed something sweet at 3 a.m. Catherine had been decorating a cake for a child's birthday party when her heart, weakened by a condition she couldn't afford to monitor and couldn't afford to medicate, had simply stopped. She died on a Tuesday, surrounded by sugar and flour and the sweet smell of things made for celebrations she would never see. Sophie was 4 years old. Daniel was 35, and everything he thought he knew about the world had turned to ash in his hands. The coffee was cold. The apartment was silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on the street below and the soft rhythm of Sophie's breathing from the bedroom. Daniel pushed himself up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had given him everything and then taken most of it away. Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, he would sit in Victoria Sterling's office and answer whatever questions she chose to ask. He would tell her the truth because he had forgotten how to do anything else, and whatever happened after that would happen. Some things were worth the guess even when you couldn't afford to pay it. Catherine had believed that. Daniel had believed it once before believing had cost him his wife. Maybe it was time to believe it again. Morning came the way mornings always came in the Hayes household, with Sophie's alarm clock blaring and her voice calling from the bedroom asking if Dad was awake and if breakfast was ready, and if he remembered that today was the day she was supposed to bring cupcakes for her class because her teacher was having a birthday and the other kids' parents had already signed up for everything else, so cupcakes were the only option left. Daniel had not remembered about the cupcakes. He was fairly certain he had never been told about the cupcakes. But he had been a parent long enough to know that these failures of communication were an inevitable part of the territory, and so he found himself standing in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, attempting to transform a box of cake mix and a container of frosting into something that would not embarrass his daughter in front of her classmates. Sophie supervised from her seat at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her, and a glass of orange juice, leaving a ring on the mathematics workbook that Daniel would have to wipe clean before returning it to her backpack. "You're putting too much frosting on that one, Dad." "There's no such thing as too much frosting. Mrs. Patterson says sugar is bad for you." Mrs. Patterson has clearly never had a bad day. Sophie giggled, the sound bright and pure in the morning light that filtered through the kitchen window. Daniel smiled despite himself, despite the sleepless night and the anxiety that had been building in his chest since his conversation with Victoria Sterling, because his daughter's laughter was the one thing in this world that never failed to remind him why he kept going. "Dad," Sophie said, her voice shifting to the particular tone that meant she was about to ask something important. "Why do you work at night?" Daniel continued spreading frosting, keeping his hands busy while his mind searched for the right words. This was a conversation they had had before in various forms and at various levels of detail, and each time he navigated it with the careful attention of a man walking through a minefield. "Because the building I work in needs to be cleaned when nobody else is there. It's easier to do my job when the offices are empty." "But why do you clean buildings? You're smart. You know math better than anyone. You could have a job where you sit at a desk like the people on TV." "I used to have a job like that, sweetheart. But sometimes things happen that change what jobs you can have." "What kind of things?" Daniel set down the frosting knife and turned to face his daughter fully. She was looking at him with those eyes that were so much like Catherine's, curious and trusting, and utterly convinced that her father had answers to every question the world could ask. "Do you remember what I told you about telling the truth even when it's hard?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Sometimes when you tell the truth, people don't like what you have to say. And sometimes those people have the power to make your life very difficult because you said something they didn't want to hear." That doesn't seem fair. It isn't fair, but that doesn't mean telling the truth was wrong. It just means that sometimes doing the right thing costs you something. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this in the way that children process difficult concepts, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture she had been building of how the world worked. Mom used to say that the truth was like medicine. It might taste bad going down, but it makes you better in the end. Daniel felt his throat tighten at the mention of Catherine, at the reminder that his wife's wisdom lived on in their daughter even though she herself was gone. "Your mother was the smartest person I ever knew. Is that why you married her?" "That's one of the reasons. There were many others." "Like what?" Daniel returned to the cupcakes, spreading frosting with more attention than the task required, because it gave him something to do with his hands while he remembered. "She made me laugh. She made me want to find a better person than I thought I could be. She looked at me like I was worth something, even when I didn't believe it myself. And she loved you more than anything in the world, even before you were born." Sophie smiled the soft smile of a child who carries her mother's memory like a treasure she guards carefully against the world. "I miss her. I miss her too, sweetheart. Every single day." They finished the cupcakes together, Sophie insisting on adding rainbow sprinkles because her teacher loved rainbows, and Daniel packed them carefully into a container that he placed in Sophie's backpack alongside her homework and her lunch and the small photograph of Catherine that she had carried with her every day since the funeral. Margaret arrived at 7:15, her timing as precise as it had been every morning for the past 3 years. She took one look at Daniel's face and shook her head slightly, the gesture of a mother who knew her son too well to be fooled by his attempts to appear rested and untroubled. "You didn't sleep. I had things on my mind. The something that happened at work." "Yes." Margaret glanced towards Sophie, who was gathering her things for school with the focused energy of a child who had exactly 3 minutes before the bus arrived. "We'll talk later. Go get some rest before tonight." Daniel nodded, grateful for her understanding and her willingness to wait for an explanation that he wasn't sure he could give. He kissed Sophie goodbye at the door, reminded her to be good and to remember her manners and to tell her teacher happy birthday, and watched her run down the stairs toward the street where the yellow school bus would be waiting. Then he closed the door and leaned against it, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that the morning routine was complete. Sleep came eventually, fitful and interrupted by dreams that mixed memory and anxiety in equal measure. He dreamed of Catherine decorating cakes in a bakery that looked like the executive suite of Sterling Financial Frosting, elaborate designs, while Victoria Sterling stood over her shoulder and demanded explanations for numerical discrepancies. He dreamed of Sophie running through corridors of glass and marble, chased by men in suits, whose faces he couldn't see, but whose voices he recognized from the legal proceedings that had stripped him of everything except his daughter and his integrity. He woke at 3 in the afternoon with a headache and a sense of dread that no amount of coffee could wash away. The afternoon hours passed with the peculiar slowness of time spent waiting for something you cannot control. Daniel showered and shaved and dressed in the only suit he still owned, a navy blue two-piece that Catherine had helped him pick out years ago for an interview he couldn't remember anymore. It didn't fit quite the same way it had then, the shoulders slightly loose from weight he had lost in the years since her death, but it would have to do. Margaret arrived at 5:30 to watch Sophie, her expression carefully neutral as she took in his appearance. "You look like you're going to a funeral. Or a job interview, I'm not sure which. What exactly happened last night, Daniel?" He told her, standing in the kitchen while Sophie worked on her homework in the other room. He told her about the conference room and the spreadsheet and the mistake he had pointed out without thinking about the consequences. He told her about Victoria Sterling's reaction about the meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock, about the certainty that she had already looked into his background and discovered the whistleblower case and the blacklisting and the 3-year gap in his employment history that marked him as untouchable in the world of high finance. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face giving nothing away, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Your father would be proud. Of what? Getting myself fired for speaking out of turn. Of not hiding who you are. Of using the brain God gave you instead of pretending you don't have it. Margaret fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. You've spent 3 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. 3 years acting like you deserve to be invisible because you did what was right and paid the price for it. Maybe this woman sees something in you that you've forgotten how to see in yourself. Or maybe she's just curious about the janitor who knows financial modeling. Either way, you go in there with your head up. Hayes men don't apologize for being smart, and they don't apologize for being honest. Whatever happens, you walk out of that building with your dignity intact. That's what matters. That's all that ever matters. Daniel hugged his mother, feeling the strength in her small frame, the decades of resilience that had carried her through losses that would have broken lesser people. Thanks, Mom. Don't thank me. Just make sure Sophie's in bed by 8:30, and don't forget her math homework needs to be checked before tomorrow. At 6:30, Daniel left the apartment and descended the stairs to the street, the evening air cool against his face as he walked toward the subway station. The city moved around him in its endless rhythm, people heading home from work and heading out to dinner and living their lives in the comfortable assumption that tomorrow would be much like today. Daniel had once made the same assumption. He had learned better. The train carried him back toward Manhattan, back toward the gleaming towers and the quarters of power, and as the stations passed one by one, he allowed himself to consider the possibilities that lay ahead. Victoria Sterling might fire him. She might offer him work that had nothing to do with cleaning floors. She might simply want to understand how a janitor had spotted a mathematical error that her entire analytical team had missed. Whatever she wanted, Daniel would give her the truth. It was in the end the only thing he had left to offer. The 48th floor of Sterling Financial was different at 7 in the evening than it had been the night before. The frantic energy of the business day had subsided, replaced by the quiet hum of computers running overnight processes, and the occasional sound of footsteps from the few executives who worked late. The lights in most offices were dimmed, creating pools of shadow between islands of illumination that made the space feel larger and more intimate at the same time. Victoria Sterling's office occupied the corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that probably cost more than Daniel had earned in his entire career at Meridian Capital. Through the glass walls that separated her space from the corridor, he could see her sitting at a desk that was organized with military precision, reading documents, with the focused attention of someone accustomed to information being presented for her consumption. He knocked on the open door and she looked up immediately, her expression unreadable in the soft light. Mr. Hayes, come in. Daniel entered the office acutely aware of the contrast between his situation now and the last time he had been in an executive office for a meeting. Then he had been the rising star, the analyst whose insights had made the firm millions. Now he was the janitor in a borrowed suit, summoned to explain how he had dared to notice something the professionals had missed. Victoria gestured to a chair across from her desk, and Daniel sat keeping his posture straight and his hands still on the armrests. She studied him for a long moment before speaking, and Daniel had the sense of being weighed and measured by a mind that processed information faster than most computers. I read your file. I assumed you would. Wharton MBA, top of your class, senior analyst at Meridian Capital Partners. On track for managing director before the age of 40. She paused, letting the silence stretch. And then nothing. A 3-year gap with no employment in the financial sector, followed by a position as a custodian in this building. Would you like to explain that trajectory, he said, Mr. Hayes? Daniel met her gaze directly, refusing to look away or apologize for the truth of his circumstances. I discovered fraud at Meridian Capital. Hundreds of millions of dollars in client funds being funneled through shell companies in the Caribbean. I gathered evidence and reported it to the SEC following all the proper procedures for whistleblower protection. And what happened? Meridian had better lawyers than I did. They painted me as a disgruntled employee attempting to extort the firm. The investigation stalled. I was terminated for cause and blacklisted throughout the industry. Every door I knocked on closed before I could finish introducing myself. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her expression still giving nothing away. The typical outcome for whistleblowers in this industry. Statistics suggest that 90% of them end up worse off than if they had simply kept quiet. I'm aware of the statistics, yet you report it anyway. I believed in the system. I believed that truth mattered and that protecting clients was more important than protecting my career. Daniel paused, allowing himself to acknowledge the cost of that belief for the first time in years. I was wrong about the system, but I wasn't wrong about the truth mattering. Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a flicker of recognition that suggested she understood more than her questions revealed. There's more to your story, the 3-year gap. What happened during that time? Daniel hesitated. This was the part he rarely spoke about, the wound that had never fully healed and probably never would. My wife, Catherine, worked 2 jobs to support us while I fought the legal battles. We burned through our savings on attorney fees. She had a heart condition that required medication and monitoring. But when we lost our health insurance, he stopped composing himself against the grief that still rose unexpectedly even after 3 years. She collapsed at her second job, a bakery in Queens. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. Victoria Sterling sat very still, her face revealing nothing, but her eyes had changed in a way that Daniel couldn't quite define. Your daughter. Sophie. She's 7. She was 4 when her mother died. And you've been cleaning floors in this building ever since. It was the only work I could get. No one in finance would touch me, and I needed to support my child. A janitor's salary doesn't provide much, but it provides enough to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. Victoria stood and walked to the window, her back to Daniel as she looked out at the city lights spreading across Manhattan like a galaxy fallen to Earth. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter than it had been, stripped of the cutting precision that served as her armor in boardroom confrontations. My father's name was Harrison Sterling. He built this company from nothing, working his way up from a small office in Brooklyn to 12 floors of prime Wall Street real estate. He died 5 years ago, and his last words to me were that I wouldn't keep the company alive for more than a year. She turned to face Daniel, and in the dim light of the office, her expression was different than anything he had seen before. Vulnerable in a way that CEOs were not supposed to be vulnerable, human in a way that challenged everything her reputation suggested. I've spent 5 years proving him wrong. I work 16-hour days. I fire executives who make excuses instead of results. I've turned profits when every competitor was bleeding red. And every morning when I wake up, I hear his voice telling me that I'm not good enough, that I don't deserve what he built, that I'm going to fail. Daniel said nothing, understanding that this confession was not something Victoria Sterling offered lightly or often. You know what I saw last night, Mr. Hayes, when you pointed out that error in the spreadsheet? I imagine you saw a janitor overstepping his bounds. I saw a man who looked at the most powerful people in my company and told them the truth without flinching, without apologizing, without caring about the consequences. Victoria returned to her desk but remained standing, looking down at Daniel with an intensity that demanded acknowledgement. I've been surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear for 5 years. Do you know how rare it is to encounter someone who simply tells the truth? Rare enough that it cost me everything. And yet you did it again. Last night, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Daniel considered his response carefully. This woman had the power to fire him, to make his already difficult life even more difficult, and she had every reason to view him as a liability rather than an asset. But something in her questions, something in the way she had revealed her own vulnerabilities, suggested that she was looking for something more than an employee to dismiss or a problem to solve. I stopped my mop because I saw numbers on a screen that didn't make sense. I shook my head because watching people make avoidable mistakes has always bothered me more than it probably should. And when you asked if I knew finance, I answered honestly because I've forgotten how to do anything else. He met her eyes, holding nothing back. You can fire me for that if you want, but I won't apologize for it. I've lost too much already to start lying about who I am. Victoria was silent for a long moment, and then she did something that surprised Daniel more than anything else that had happened in the past 24 hours. She smiled. Not the professional smile she deployed in meetings and press conferences, the carefully calibrated expression that communicated confidence without warmth. This was something genuine, something that transformed her face and made her look younger and less armored, and almost for just a moment like someone who had forgotten how lonely it was at the top. "I'd like to offer you a consulting contract, Mr. Hayes, 3 months working with my analytical team to troubleshoot their methodology. The compensation will be significantly more than your current salary, and the hours will be flexible enough to accommodate your responsibilities to your daughter." Daniel stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You want to hire the janitor to fix your financial models. I want to hire the man who spotted an $18 million mistake in 30 seconds to help ensure my team doesn't make similar mistakes in the future. The fact that he currently works as a janitor is irrelevant. Your team won't accept that. They'll see me as an outsider, an interloper, someone who doesn't belong in their meetings. Then I'll introduce you as a specialized consultant. They don't need to know your current job title. That's deception. I prefer to think of it as strategic omission." Victoria's smile widened slightly. "Unless you have an objection to people not knowing that you spend your nights cleaning their offices." Daniel thought about the offer, turning it over in his mind, the way he turned over numbers and equations, and the hidden patterns that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly straightforward data. There were risks. His colleagues, the people whose mistakes he would be catching and whose egos he would be bruising, would eventually discover his background. The same forces that had destroyed him at Meridian were still active in the industry, and his reemergence might attract attention he couldn't afford. But there was also Sophie to consider. Sophie, who deserved a father who used his gifts instead of hiding them. Sophie, who Catherine had died believing would grow up to see the best of what Daniel could be. "I have one condition." "Name it." "I work around my daughter's schedule. Nothing interferes with her time. I need to be home before she goes to bed, and I need to be available for school events and emergencies." Victoria nodded without hesitation. "Agreed. We can structure your hours to accommodate that. Is there anything else?" Daniel stood, extending his hand across the desk. "Only that you understand what you're getting. I don't soft-pedal mistakes. I don't protect egos at the expense of accuracy. If your team is wrong about something, I'll say so, regardless of who it offends." Victoria took his hand, her grip firm and businesslike. "That's precisely why I'm hiring you, Mr. Hayes." As Daniel left her office and walked toward the elevator that would carry him back down to the street, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly. He had learned to be careful with hope, but something adjacent to it. The sense that perhaps after all the loss and the betrayal and the grinding daily effort of simply surviving there, might still be a chapter of his story left to write. The elevator doors closed, and Daniel Hayes descended from the 48th floor, leaving behind the world of power and money that had broken him, and embracing for the first time since Catherine's death, the possibility that he might one day belong there again. The consulting arrangement began quietly, the way significant changes often do. Daniel arrived at Sterling Financial 3 evenings a week after Sophie was settled with Margaret, and her homework was checked, and her bedtime story was read. He wore the suit Catherine had helped him choose, the navy blue that still didn't fit quite right, but represented something important about who he was trying to be. And he sat in conference rooms with people who had no idea that the specialized consultant, reviewing their spreadsheets, had mopped their floors just weeks before. The first meeting established the pattern that would define the months to come. Daniel entered a room full of analysts who regarded him with a particular suspicion that financial professionals reserve for outsiders who might understand their work. Mark Sullivan, the silver-haired head of quantitative analysis, made no effort to hide his displeasure at being second-guessed by someone whose credentials he hadn't been allowed to verify. Victoria presided over these sessions from the head of the table, watching the dynamics unfold with an expression that gave nothing away. She had made the terms of Daniel's engagement clear to her team. He would review their work, offer suggestions, and identify potential problems before they became expensive mistakes. Whether they liked it or not was irrelevant. They did not like it. The first spreadsheet Daniel examined contained 3 separate errors in its assumptions about currency, volatility errors that would have resulted in projected losses significantly understating actual exposure. He pointed them out methodically, walking the team through the mathematical reasoning that made the corrections necessary, and watched the lead analyst's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally a reluctant acknowledgement. "How did you catch that?" The question came from a young analyst named Jennifer Park, whose curiosity apparently outweighed her caution about appearing too interested in the outsider's methods. Daniel shrugged. I've spent a lot of time looking at numbers. After a while, you develop an instinct for when something doesn't fit. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had spent years training his mind to see patterns that others missed, to question assumptions that others accepted, to follow threads of logic to their ultimate conclusions, regardless of where they led. But that wasn't the kind of answer that would make him friends in a room full of people whose professional competence he had just questioned. The meetings continued. Daniel found errors in risk calculations, identified flawed assumptions in market projections, and caught a proposed acquisition target whose intellectual property portfolio was significantly overvalued due to expiring patents that the due diligence team had somehow overlooked. Each correction saved the company money. Each correction also deepened the resentment of the people whose work he was examining. Mark Sullivan confronted Victoria after the third week in a conversation that Daniel wasn't supposed to hear, but did standing in the corridor outside her office with a report she had asked him to deliver. "This is embarrassing, Victoria. You're bringing in someone off the street to second-guess work that my team has been doing successfully for years." Victoria's response was calm and unhesitating. "Your team missed an $18 million error. Daniel caught it in 30 seconds. I'm not interested in your feelings about that, Mark. I'm interested in results. His credentials haven't been verified. We don't even know if his background checks out. His credentials include catching every mistake your team has made since he started. That's verification enough for me." Sullivan left the office with his face flushed and his jaw tight, passing Daniel in the corridor without acknowledging his presence. It was the beginning of a pattern that would escalate over the weeks to come, the quiet hostility of professionals who didn't appreciate being shown up by someone they had dismissed as beneath their notice. But there were also moments of connection, unexpected instances of human warmth in an environment that valued precision over emotion. Jennifer Parks sought Daniel out after meetings, asking questions about methodology and listening to his answers with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in learning. An older analyst named Robert Chen, who had been with the company since Harrison Sterling's time, shared stories about the early days over coffee in the break room, treating Daniel with a respect that suggested he didn't care about titles or backgrounds, only competence. And there was Victoria herself, whose evening conversations with Daniel began to extend beyond the strictly professional. They talked about finance, certainly debating monetary policy and market trends and the ethical implications of various investment strategies. But they also talked about other things, about the pressure of expectations and the weight of legacy, and the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in a room full of people who either feared you or wanted something from you. One evening, after a particularly contentious meeting in which Daniel had identified a flaw in a proposed derivative strategy that would have exposed the company to significant liability, Victoria asked him to stay behind. "You understand what you're doing to my team, don't you?" Daniel nodded. "I'm undermining their confidence, making them question their own competence, creating enemies who will remember every time I've made them look bad. And you're doing it anyway. Because the alternative is watching them make mistakes that could cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. I can't stay quiet about that. It's not in my nature." Victoria was silent for a moment, studying him with an expression he had come to recognize over the past weeks. Evaluating, reassessing, trying to understand something about him that didn't fit her expectations. "My father used to say that the most dangerous person in a company is the one who's willing to tell the truth, because everyone else is protecting their position, their reputation, their future. But the truth teller doesn't care about any of that. They just care about getting it right." "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation. My father said it like a warning, but I think he was wrong." Victoria turned to look out the window at the city lights, her voice thoughtful in a way that suggested she was working through something in real time. "The most valuable person in a company is the one who tells the truth, because without that, everything else is just pretense." Daniel watched her profile against the glittering backdrop of Manhattan, this woman who had inherited an empire and spent 5 years defending it against everyone who doubted she deserved it. There was something in her voice tonight that he hadn't heard before, a vulnerability that she usually kept locked away behind her armor of competence and control. "You're not like the other executives I've known," he said, not entirely sure why he was saying it. Victoria turned back to face him, a ghost of a smile on her lips. Neither are you, Mr. Hayes, and please, after 3 weeks of watching you outperform my entire analytical team, I think you can call me Victoria. Daniel, then. Daniel. She tried the name out like she was testing its weight. I should warn you that calling me by my first name might give my employees the impression that we're on equal footing. We're not. You sign my paycheck and have the power to end my career with a phone call. But I've stopped pretending that power dynamics determine who gets to speak honestly. Losing everything will do that to a person. Yes, it will. They stood there for a moment, two people who had learned through different paths that the rules everyone else followed were less important than the principles that remained when the rules were stripped away. Then Victoria laughed, a sound that surprised Daniel and clearly surprised her as well. Do you know the last time someone spoke to me like that? Like I was a person instead of a title? No. Neither do I, which tells you everything you need to know about my life. She moved toward her desk, gathering papers into her briefcase with efficient movements. Same time Thursday, Daniel. I have a feeling the derivatives team is going to give us plenty to discuss. Daniel nodded and left the office, walking through the empty corridors to the elevator with something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Not hope, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sense that in this unexpected place, in this unlikely relationship, he had found something worth nurturing. He didn't notice the security camera in the corner of the hallway, its lens pointed directly at the door of Victoria Sterling's office. And he didn't notice the man in the control room on the 45th floor who was watching the footage with particular interest. Marcus Blackwell had been watching for weeks now, and what he saw concerned him greatly. The man who sat in the leather chair on the 45th floor of Sterling Financial was not someone who appeared in the company's public materials or gave interviews to the business press. Marcus Blackwell preferred to operate in the shadows, wielding influence through connections and leverage rather than direct confrontation. He had survived 3 decades in the financial industry by understanding that the most important battles were fought quietly in private offices and closed-door meetings where the real decisions were made before they were ever announced to the world. He was 62 years old with silver hair that was styled to suggest distinguished rather than old, and a face that had been carefully maintained to project an image of benevolent authority. He had served on the board of Sterling Financial since Harrison Sterling's time, one of the founding members who had helped build the company from its modest beginnings into the empire it had become. His official title was Chairman of the Board of Directors, a position that came with significant power and minimal accountability, exactly the way he preferred it. He was also, as few people knew, deeply invested in ensuring that certain aspects of the company's history remained buried. The security footage played on the screen in front of him, showing Daniel Hayes leaving Victoria Sterling's office after another of their evening conversations. Raymond Cross Blackwell's personal attorney and most trusted confidant stood behind him, watching the same footage with an expression that suggested he understood its implications. 3 weeks. Blackwell said, his voice soft in a way that would have alarmed anyone who knew him well. She's been meeting with this man for 3 weeks and nobody thought to inform me. The arrangement was presented as routine consulting, an outside specialist to review analytical methodology. There was no indication that it warranted board attention. An outside specialist. Blackwell turned from the screen to face Cross directly. Do we know who this man actually is? Daniel Hayes, former senior analyst at Meridian Capital Partners. He was terminated 4 years ago following a whistleblower complaint that was ultimately dismissed. Since then, he's been working as a custodian in this building. Blackwell was silent for a long moment, processing this information with the particular attention of someone who understood that details others might dismiss as irrelevant could be explosively significant. Meridian Capital, the company that Harrison Sterling served on the advisory board of from 2019 until his death. The same. And this Hayes person, the whistleblower whose complaint was dismissed, is now consulting for Harrison Sterling's daughter. It appears so. Blackwell rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the same view of Manhattan that Victoria Sterling saw from her corner office 3 floors above. But where she might see opportunity and possibility, he saw only threat. The carefully constructed edifice of lies and omissions that had protected him for years was suddenly looking far less stable than it had seemed just hours ago. Tell me about his complaint, the specifics. Cross consulted a tablet, scrolling through documents that had been assembled at Blackwell's request over the past several days. Hayes claimed to have discovered a systematic fraud involving the diversion of client funds through shell companies in the Caribbean. His complaint identified specific transactions, specific accounts, and specific individuals he believed to be responsible. Was Harrison Sterling named? Not directly, but several of the documents Hayes submitted to the SEC bore signatures from members of Meridian's advisory board, including Harrison Sterling, and Cross hesitated, glancing at Blackwell. And yourself, sir. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside the window, a helicopter passed in the distance, its lights blinking against the dark sky. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and went unanswered. Those documents were supposed to have been destroyed. They were. All copies within Meridian systems were eliminated as part of the legal settlement. But Hayes apparently maintained his own records, and there's no way to know what he kept or where it might be stored. Blackwell turned from the window, and his face in the dim light of the office was no longer the mask of benevolent authority he showed to the world. There was something cold there now, something calculating and utterly without sentiment. Victoria Sterling doesn't know about her father's involvement with Meridian. She was deliberately kept in the dark after Harrison's death, and everything I've seen suggests she continues to believe he was simply an innocent bystander to whatever problems the company might have had. That appears to be the case. If Hayes tells her the truth, if he shows her whatever evidence he's kept, she might start asking questions that would be very uncomfortable for everyone involved, including yourself, including myself. Blackwell walked back to his desk and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. I need to know everything about Daniel Hayes, his background, his current circumstances, his vulnerabilities. I need to know what he wants and what he fears and what might be used to ensure his silence. And if he can't be silenced, Blackwell looked at Cross with an expression that conveyed everything his words did not say. Then we'll need to consider other options. Cross nodded and left the office, closing the door softly behind him. Blackwell remained at his desk, staring at the frozen image of Daniel Hayes on the security monitor, and allowed himself to feel the fear that he kept hidden from everyone else. He had spent 30 years building his position, accumulating wealth and power, and the connections that allowed him to operate above the rules that constrained ordinary people. He had survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser men, navigated transitions of power that had claimed countless casualties, emerged from every crisis stronger and more entrenched than before. But he had never faced a threat quite like this one. A man with nothing to lose and everything to prove, allied with a woman who had the resources to dig into secrets that should have stayed buried forever. If Daniel Hayes knew the full truth about Meridian Capital, about Harrison Sterling's involvement, about Blackwell's own role in the cover-up that had followed, then everything was at risk. Everything. Marcus Blackwell did not believe in coincidence. The appearance of this particular man in this particular company at this particular time suggested a pattern that demanded response. Whether that response would be containment or elimination remained to be determined. But one way or another, Daniel Hayes would have to be dealt with. The photograph hung on the wall of Victoria Sterling's office like a window into a past that she could see but never quite reach. Harrison Sterling shaking hands with the governor of New York. Both men smiling the particular smile of people who understood that cameras were watching and posterity was being created. It was the only personal item in the office, the only hint that the woman who commanded this space had once been a daughter, had once looked up at the man in that photograph, and believed he was the greatest person in the world. Daniel noticed Victoria looking at it one evening, her expression unreadable, and asked a question he had been carrying for weeks. "Tell me about your father." Victoria didn't answer immediately. She stood at the window with her back to him, looking out at the city that Harrison Sterling had conquered through force of will and relentless ambition. He built this company from nothing. A small office in Brooklyn, a second-hand desk, a phone that didn't work half the time. He used to tell me stories about those early days, about how he would work 18-hour shifts and sleep on a cot in the corner and eat nothing but coffee and determination for weeks at a time. He sounds driven. He was obsessed. Success wasn't just something he wanted, it was something he needed the way other people need air. He couldn't conceive of failure. The very possibility was incomprehensible to him. Victoria turned from the window, and in the dim light, her face held something that might have been grief, or might have been anger, or might have been both at once. And he couldn't conceive of me succeeding either. His last words to me, the last thing he ever said, was that I wouldn't keep the company alive for a year. Daniel absorbed this, fitting it into the picture of Victoria Sterling that he had been building over the weeks of their collaboration. The 16-hour days, the intolerance for excuses, the armor of competence and control that she wore like a second skin. He was wrong. Was he? Victoria sat down in the chair across from Daniel, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. Not the uncertainty of someone who didn't know the answer, but the deeper uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure the question could ever be answered. I've kept the company profitable. I've grown the portfolio. I've done everything he said I couldn't do, but sometimes I wonder if I've actually succeeded or if I've just delayed the inevitable failure he predicted. The numbers suggest success. Numbers can be manipulated. Results can be manufactured. You know that better than anyone, Daniel. You spent your career looking for the laws hidden behind the numbers. It was the closest she had come to acknowledging his past, directly the whistleblower case and the destruction that had followed. Daniel considered his response carefully. I know that numbers can be made to say almost anything, but I also know that some things can't be faked. Leadership, vision, the ability to make decisions when everyone around you is too scared to move. Those aren't things your father gave you or that his doubt could take away. Those are things you've earned. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel had the sense that no one had said anything like this to her before, that the people who surrounded her were either too intimidated or too invested in their own positions to offer genuine assessment rather than flattery or criticism. You're different than I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? I'm not sure. Someone bitter, maybe. Someone who would see this company and everyone in it as the enemy. Someone who would be looking for revenge against the system that destroyed him. Daniel thought about this, about the anger that had consumed him in the months after Catherine's death, about the fantasies of retribution that had kept him awake at night while Sophie slept in the next room. I was bitter. For a long time after Catherine died, I hated everything. The system that had betrayed me, the people who had stood by while my life was destroyed, even myself for believing that telling the truth would somehow make things better. He paused, searching for the right words. But bitterness is a luxury I couldn't afford. I had a daughter who needed her father to be present, not consumed by anger at things he couldn't change. So I learned to let go of the parts that would have poisoned me. How do you let go of something like that? Daniel smiled, remembering a conversation in a Queen's apartment with his mother's practical wisdom ringing in his ears. My mother told me that Hayes men don't break. We bend when we have to, but we don't break. And I realized that staying bitter would be a form of breaking. It would mean letting the people who destroyed me win twice, once by taking my career and again by taking my ability to move forward. Victoria nodded slowly, processing this in the way that Daniel had come to recognize, turning it over in her mind like a problem that required solving. I don't know if I could do that. Let go of something that hurt me so deeply. You might surprise yourself. People often do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights glittering beyond the windows and the buildings settling around them with the quiet sounds of an empire preparing for sleep. Then Victoria stirred, reaching for the briefcase that sat beside her chair. I should let you get home to Sophie. She's probably already asleep. My mother stays with her on the nights I work late. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. She is. She survived raising 3 children on a nurse's salary while my father worked the docks. She buried him after 40 years of marriage and didn't stop moving long enough to let the grief catch up with her. And when Catherine died, she moved into the apartment upstairs so Sophie would have someone to come home to while I was working. Daniel stood gathering his own things. She says I worry too much and work too hard and need to remember that life isn't only about surviving. She sounds like she might be right. She usually is. It's one of the more annoying things about her. Victoria laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Daniel found himself smiling in response. In that moment, they were not employer and consultant, not the CEO of a financial empire and the former janitor she had plucked from obscurity. They were simply 2 people who had discovered that conversation with each other was easier than conversation with almost anyone else. Same time tomorrow, Victoria asked as Daniel moved toward the door. I'll be here. He left the office and walked through the empty corridors to the elevator, And as he descended through the 48 floors of Sterling Financial, he allowed himself to acknowledge something that he had been avoiding for weeks. He was starting to care about Victoria Sterling. Not in the way that employees care about employers or that consultants care about clients. In some more complicated way that he couldn't quite define and didn't want to examine too closely. It was dangerous, this caring. It created vulnerabilities where there should be none exposed surfaces that the world could wound. He had learned that lesson with Catherine, had learned what it cost to let someone inside the walls he had built around himself. But standing in the elevator as it carried him toward the street, Daniel realized that he might not have a choice. Some connections formed regardless of the risks, regardless of the consequences, regardless of all the reasons why they shouldn't exist. And this connection, whatever it was becoming, felt like something he needed to see through to the end. The discovery came by accident, the way most dangerous discoveries do. Daniel was working late in the conference room on the 48th floor, reviewing a complex risk analysis model that had been giving Victoria's team problems for weeks. The building was quiet around him, the cleaning staff having finished hours ago, and the security guards making their rounds on floors far below. He had the sense of being alone in a glass tower, suspended above a city that moved on without noticing his presence. He needed a reference document from the archives, a historical analysis of similar market conditions that might shed light on the model's persistent errors. Victoria had given him access to the company's digital archives, and he navigated through the filing system with the focused attention that had always characterized his work. The folder he was looking for was buried deep in a directory structure that seemed designed to discourage casual exploration. As Daniel clicked through the layers of files and subfolders, he passed a folder labeled Board Advisory Archives and paused. It was not unusual for a company to maintain records of its advisory board's activities. What was unusual was the date range associated with this particular folder, 2019 to 2022. And what was even more unusual was the name that appeared in the folder's description, Meridian Capital Partners. Daniel's hand hovered over the mouse, his heart suddenly beating faster than it had been a moment ago. Every instinct he had developed over years of forensic financial analysis was screaming at him that this was significant, that this was the kind of discovery that changed everything. He clicked on the folder. The documents inside were organized chronologically, meeting minutes and policy recommendations and financial projections that painted a picture of collaboration between Sterling Financial and Meridian Capital that Daniel had never known existed. But it was not the collaboration itself that stopped his breath in his chest. It was the signatures at the bottom of the key documents. Harrison Sterling's signature appearing again and again on papers that Daniel recognized that he had seen in different contexts during his own investigation of Meridian's fraud. Harrison Sterling, Victoria's father, had been a member of Meridian's advisory board during the exact period when the fraud was being perpetrated and concealed. Daniel sat very still in the empty conference room, the glow of the computer screen casting shadows across his face, and tried to process what he was seeing. Harrison Sterling's involvement with Meridian had never been part of the public record. It had never come up in Daniel's research or in the legal proceedings that had followed his whistleblower complaint. The connection had been deliberately hidden, buried so deep that only someone with access to Sterling Financial's private archives would ever discover it. He kept reading, clicking through documents with hands that were not entirely steady, and the picture that emerged became progressively more damning. Harrison Sterling had not merely been a passive member of Meridian's advisory board. He had been an active participant in discussions about the company's financial structure, had signed off on recommendations that Daniel now recognized as the foundation for the shell company scheme he had uncovered. Whether Harrison had known what he was approving was impossible to determine from the documents alone. The language was carefully constructed to provide plausible deniability, full of technical jargon and legal hedging that could be interpreted in multiple ways. But his signature was there, undeniable, linking him to the fraud that had destroyed Daniel's career and ultimately cost Catherine her life. Daniel closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of the conference room without seeing it. His mind was racing, processing implications and possibilities and the terrible irony of finding himself in this position. He had taken a job cleaning floors in the building owned by the daughter of a man who might have been complicit in the fraud that ruined him. He had accepted a consulting contract from that same daughter, had developed what he could only call a friendship with her, had allowed himself to care about her in ways that felt increasingly significant. And now he had discovered something that could destroy her, that could shatter the image she had of her father, and call into question everything she had built in his memory. The ethical calculation was not simple. Victoria was not her father. Whatever Harrison Sterling had done or known, his daughter had no part in it. She had inherited a company and tried to run it with integrity, had shown Daniel more respect and consideration than anyone in the financial industry had shown him in years. But she also deserved the truth. She was making decisions based on beliefs about her father that might be fundamentally wrong. And the people who had been hurt by Meridian's fraud, the pensioners and savers whose money had disappeared into offshore accounts, deserved justice, even if that justice came too late to help them. Daniel thought about Catherine, about the medication she couldn't afford, and the second job that had killed her. He thought about Sophie, about the questions she would ask someday, about why her father had spent years cleaning floors instead of using his education and his talents. He thought about the man he had been before the whistleblower case, the man who had believed that truth mattered more than consequences. That man would have gone straight to Victoria with what he had found, would have laid out the documents and demanded answers and let the chips fall where they fell. But that man had been destroyed by his belief in truth, and the man who remained was more cautious, more aware of the ways that good intentions could lead to terrible outcomes. He needed time to think, time to understand what he had found and what it meant and what he should do about it. Time to figure out how to navigate a situation that had suddenly become far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. Daniel closed the archive system and shut down the computer, erasing his digital footprints, with the practiced skill of someone who had learned the hard way to be careful about what traces he left behind. Then he gathered his things and left the conference room, walking through the empty corridors to the elevator that would carry him away from the 48th floor and its secrets. As the elevator descended, he looked at his reflection in the polished metal doors and wondered who he was becoming. The man who mopped floors and kept his head down and asked nothing from a world that had taken everything from him. Or the man who had once believed that truth was worth any cost, even when the cost was higher than he could bear. He didn't know the answer, but he knew that he would have to find it soon, because the secret he had discovered would not stay buried forever, and when it emerged, everything would change. For everyone. The weeks that followed the discovery were a study in compartmentalization, the ability to perform one role while carrying the weight of knowledge that contradicted everything that role represented. Daniel continued his consulting work, attending meetings and reviewing analyses and pointing out errors that Victoria's team increasingly resented. He continued his conversations with Victoria, discussing financial strategy and market conditions and the peculiar challenges of running a company that bore your family name. He continued to be charming and competent and engaged, while some part of his mind remained fixed on the documents he had found and the questions they raised. He had not told Victoria what he had discovered. He told himself this was because he needed more information needed to understand the full scope of Harrison Sterling's involvement before making accusations that could not be taken back. He told himself this was caution rather than cowardice, strategic patience rather than moral failure. But late at night, in the quiet of his Queens apartment, with Sophie asleep in the next room, Daniel knew that the real reason was simpler and more damning. He did not want to hurt Victoria. He did not want to be the one to shatter her image of her father, to add to the burden she already carried. He cared about her, more than he should, more than was wise or professional or safe, and that caring complicated everything. Margaret noticed, of course. Margaret noticed everything, had spent 68 years developing the ability to read her children's silences as fluently as their words. She confronted him one Sunday morning after Sophie had been dispatched to a birthday party and the apartment was quiet except for the sounds of the city beyond the windows. "You've been different these past few weeks. Distracted. Like you're carrying something you don't want to put down." Daniel considered denying it, dismissing her observation with the deflections that had become second nature. But this was his mother, who had seen him through every crisis of his life and never once accepted easy answers when hard truths were required. "I found something at work, something about Victoria Sterling's father that she doesn't know. Something bad, potentially. It suggests he might have been involved with the fraud at Meridian Capital, the same fraud that destroyed my career." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the thoughtful attention she brought to every problem worth solving. "And you haven't told her?" "No. Why not?" Daniel stood from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Sophie would soon be returning from her party full of sugar and excitement and the innocent certainty that the world was fundamentally kind. Because I don't know what telling her would accomplish. Because I don't have enough information to be certain of what I found. Because you care about her. Daniel turned to face his mother, finding in her expression not judgment, but understanding. Yes, I care about her. And I know how it sounds, how it looks, the janitor falling for the CEO like some kind of ridiculous fairy tale. But she's not what I expected. She's smart and driven and lonely in ways that I recognize. She looks at me like I'm worth something, like my ideas matter, like I'm more than the sum of my failures. Like Catherine did. The mention of his wife's name stopped Daniel's words in his throat. He hadn't made that connection consciously, had not allowed himself to examine what his feelings for Victoria might mean in relation to the woman he had loved and lost. I don't know what I feel. I know that it's complicated. I know that the situation is impossible in about a dozen different ways. And I know that finding those documents has made everything even more complicated than it already was. Margaret rose from the table and crossed to where Daniel stood, placing her hand on his arm, with the particular gentleness that mothers never lose, regardless of how old their children become. Your father used to say that the most important thing in life is to be able to look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. To know that you've done the right thing even when the right thing is hard. What's the right thing here, Mom? Telling her something that will hurt her, that might destroy her relationship with her father's memory, or protecting her from truth she never asked to know. The right thing is rarely obvious, Daniel. If it were, everyone would do it. Margaret squeezed his arm gently. But I will tell you this. Your father spent 40 years working those docks, and he never once hid the truth to protect himself or anyone else. He said that lies were like debts. They accumulated interest until they became impossible to pay back. Whatever you decide, remember that. Sophie returned an hour later, bursting through the door with tales of cake and games and a boy named Tyler who had apparently done something so embarrassing that it would be discussed in her class for years to come. Daniel listened to her stories and helped her with her homework and made dinner while Margaret dozed in the armchair by the window, and the documents in the Sterling Financial Archives felt very far away. But they were not far away. They were waiting for him, and eventually he would have to decide what to do about them. The relationship between Daniel and Victoria continued to evolve, deepening in ways that neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them recognized. Their evening conversations grew longer, ranging further from strictly professional topics into the territory of personal histories and private fears. Victoria told Daniel about her mother who had died when Victoria was 12 and left her in the care of a father who did not know how to be soft, did not know how to raise a daughter without a woman's guidance. Daniel told Victoria about Sophie's birth, about the moment he had held his daughter for the first time, and felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what mattered in the world. They did not touch, did not cross the lines that professional relationships are supposed to maintain. But there was an intimacy in their conversations that went beyond anything either of them had experienced with anyone else in years. The intimacy of being truly seen, truly understood by someone who carried similar wounds and had learned similar lessons from the world's cruelty. One evening after a particularly difficult meeting in which Mark Sullivan had openly challenged Daniel's analysis and Victoria had defended him with cold precision, they sat together in her office with takeout containers between them and the city glittering beyond the windows. "You know they're going to keep fighting you," Daniel said. "Sullivan and his faction. They see me as a threat to their position, and they are not going to stop pushing until either I'm gone or they are. Let them push. I've survived worse. I'm serious, Victoria. The hostility is getting more intense. Eventually, someone is going to dig into my background more carefully than you did, and when they find out about my past, they'll find out that you were blacklisted for telling the truth about corruption, that you lost your career because you had more integrity than the people who were supposed to oversee you." Victoria set down her chopsticks and met his eyes directly. "That's not the ammunition they think it is, Daniel. That's a credential. In a sane world, maybe, but we don't live in a sane world." Victoria was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than it had been. "Why did you really take this job, the consulting contract? You had to know it would put you back in contact with the world that had hurt you, with people who would look down on you for what you've been doing these past 3 years. Daniel considered the question, considering too how much truth he was willing to offer in response. When you asked me to explain the error in your spreadsheet that first night, I could have deflected, could have pretended I hadn't seen it, gone back to my work, stayed invisible. But something in me wouldn't let me do that. Some instinct that I thought I had killed finally woke up. What instinct? The instinct that truth matters, that speaking up is worth the risk even when the risk is real. He paused, searching for words that would capture something he barely understood himself. Catherine used to say that I was born to notice things other people missed, to say the things other people were afraid to say. She said it like it was a gift, but it always felt more like a curse. The inability to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier. Victoria nodded slowly. I understand that. The inability to pretend everything is fine when you can see clearly that it isn't. Is that why you hired me? Because you recognize that in me? Partly, but also because I needed someone who wasn't afraid of me. Do you know how rare that is? People who work for me are either intimidated or trying to manipulate me or protecting their own positions. You walked into my conference room and pointed out an $18 million mistake without caring what it might cost you. I hadn't seen that kind of courage in years. It wasn't courage, it was compulsion. The best courage usually is. They looked at each other across the desk, and Daniel felt something shift in the air between them, some barrier that had been gradually weakening, finally beginning to give way. He should stop this, he knew. Should maintain the distance that professionalism required and that common sense demanded. Should remember the secrets he was carrying in the ways this relationship was already complicated beyond his ability to manage. But he did not move away when Victoria stood and came around the desk to stand beside him. He did not protest when she reached out and touched his hand with a gesture that was tentative and certain at the same time. I don't know what this is, she said quietly. Between us, I've spent 5 years not allowing myself to feel anything for anyone because feelings are vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities can be exploited. But when I'm with you, I know. Daniel stood, bringing them closer together, close enough that he could see the uncertainty in her eyes that matched the uncertainty in his own heart. I don't know what this is either. I know it's complicated and probably impossible, and that there are reasons why we shouldn't. There are always reasons why we shouldn't. There are never enough reasons why we should. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Catherine understood that, didn't she? That life doesn't wait for the reasons to line up. That sometimes you have to take what's offered before it disappears. Daniel thought about Catherine, about the way she had reached for life with both hands regardless of the risks, about the years they had spent together, too few but more precious than anything else he had known, about the lessons she had taught him through her love and through her death, that playing it safe was just another way of dying slowly. She used to say that the saddest words in any language were what if. That regret was worse than failure because at least failure meant you had tried. Then let's try. Victoria kissed him, and Daniel let go of all the reasons why this was a mistake, all the complications and secrets and impossibilities that surrounded them. He kissed her back, and for one moment in the quiet of an office on the 48th floor of a building that represented everything that had destroyed him, he felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Hope. The hope did not last because hope in Daniel's experience rarely did. The confrontation came without warning on an evening that had seemed no different from any other. Daniel arrived at Victoria's office for their usual meeting, expecting the conversations about financial models and market conditions that had become the framework for their increasingly personal connection. Instead, he found Victoria standing at the window with her back to the door, her posture rigid in a way that immediately told him something was wrong. Close the door, he did, moving into the office with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in small signals. What's happened? Victoria turned, and her face was different than he had ever seen it. The armor was gone, stripped away to reveal something raw and wounded underneath. She held a folder in her hands, and Daniel recognized the format before she even showed him what was inside. Archived documents. The same documents he had found weeks ago and had been struggling with ever since. I received these this morning, an anonymous package left with my assistant. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped the folder. They appear to be records from my father's involvement with Meridian Capital Partners, records that suggest he was complicit in the fraud you tried to expose. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face, felt the ground shifting beneath his feet in the particular way it always did when carefully maintained illusions collapsed. Victoria, you knew. It was not a question. I can see it in your face. You knew about this, and you didn't tell me. I found the documents a few weeks ago in the company archives. I was trying to figure out how to break it to me gently, how to manipulate the timing for maximum effect. Victoria's voice rose, anger replacing the wound in her expression. How to continue your consulting contract and your access to this company while keeping secrets that should have been revealed immediately. It wasn't like that. I was trying to understand what the documents meant, whether Harrison actually knew what he was signing, whether my father was a criminal or just a fool. Victoria laughed bitterly. Those are my only options, aren't they? Either he helped defraud thousands of people out of their life savings, or he was too stupid or too careless to realize what he was putting his signature to. Daniel stepped forward, reaching for her, and Victoria stepped back as if his touch had become something dangerous. Don't try to comfort me while you're the one who's been lying to me for weeks. I wasn't lying. I was strategically omitting like I did when I introduced you to my team as a consultant without mentioning that you'd been cleaning their offices. Victoria shook her head, a harsh sound escaping her throat. You let me do that. Let me deceive them while you were deceiving me. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to lose your access, your position, your connection to someone who could help rebuild the career that was destroyed when you told the truth about Meridian. Victoria's eyes were bright with tears she seemed determined not to shed. Was that the plan all along? Get close to me, find evidence about my father, use it as leverage? No. Daniel's voice was fierce, more forceful than he had intended. That was never the plan. There was no plan. I took a job cleaning floors because it was the only work I could get, and I pointed out your spreadsheet error because I can't keep my mouth shut when I see mistakes. And everything that followed happened because I started to care about you. Not about the company or the leverage or the opportunity. About you. Victoria stared at him, and in her face, Daniel could see the war between wanting to believe him and the evidence that suggested she shouldn't. My father's name is on those documents. Your wife died because of what Meridian did. How am I supposed to believe that you didn't see me as an opportunity for revenge? Because revenge would require me to hate you, and I don't hate you. Daniel stopped gathering himself against the truth he had not intended to speak. I'm falling in love with you, Victoria. I've been fighting it because it's complicated and impossible, and there are 100 reasons why it shouldn't happen. But I can't fight what's true any more than I can keep quiet about mathematical errors. The silence that followed stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its endless rhythm, oblivious to the personal crisis unfolding in one corner office among thousands. I don't know if I can believe that, Victoria said finally, her voice quieter, now drained of the anger that had sustained it. I don't know if I can believe anything right now. Then don't believe it. Test it. Ask me anything and I'll answer honestly. Look into my background, my movements, my finances. Find someone you trust to verify everything I've told you. Daniel held her gaze, refusing to look away. The documents about your father are real. My feelings for you are also real. Both things can be true at the same time. How philosophical. Victoria's tone was bitter, but there was something else underneath it, something that might have been the beginning of acceptance. My father spent his life teaching me that business and emotion don't mix, that caring about people makes you vulnerable to manipulation. And here I am vulnerable because I started to care about someone who had every reason to hurt me. I would never, please don't make promises you can't keep. Victoria walked past him to her desk, setting down the folder of documents with deliberate care. I need time to process what's in these documents, to figure out what I believe about my father and about you, to decide what happens next. Daniel nodded, understanding that this was not a negotiation, but a statement of fact. Take whatever time you need. I'll stay away until you're ready to talk. The consulting contract is suspended, effective immediately. I understand. He moved toward this door, pausing with his hand on the handle to look back at her one more time. She stood behind her desk, with her hands pressed flat against its surface, as if she needed the solid wood to keep herself from falling. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For not telling you sooner. For the pain that knowing is causing you. For everything. Victoria did not respond, did not look up as he left the office, and walked through the empty corridors to the elevator. The doors closed on his reflection in the polished metal, and Daniel descended through the 48 floors of a building that had become something more than just a workplace over the past months. He had told the truth in the end, not in the way he had planned, not with the careful context and gentle delivery he had imagined. But the truth was out now, and whatever consequences followed would follow. Catherine would have said that was all anyone could do. Tell the truth and trust that the universe would eventually sort things out. Catherine had been an optimist. Daniel had learned to be more cautious. But standing in the elevator as it carried him toward the street, he allowed himself to hope that this time the truth might lead somewhere other than destruction. The days that followed were a particular kind of purgatory suspended between the life Daniel had been building and whatever would come next. He returned to his night shift cleaning duties, trading the conference rooms of the 48th floor for the basement supply closet and the methodical work of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. His colleagues on the custodial staff noticed nothing different about him because to them he had never been anything other than the quiet man in the blue uniform who did his job without complaint and went home to his daughter in Queens. Sophie noticed something was wrong. She was 7 years old, but she had her mother's intuition and her father's attention to detail, and she could tell that her father was carrying something heavier than usual. Dad, are you sad? They were sitting at the kitchen table, Daniel helping her with homework that she probably didn't need help with when she asked the question. I'm not sad, sweetheart, just thinking about some things. What thing? Daniel considered how to explain the complexities of adult relationships and professional betrayals to a child who still believed that the world was fundamentally fair. You know how sometimes you have to choose between two things and both choices are hard? Sophie nodded solemnly. Like when Lily and Emma both wanted me to sit with them at lunch and I had to pick one. Something like that. I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do in a situation where every choice has consequences. What did Mom used to say about hard choices? Daniel smiled despite himself. Sophie had started doing this a few months ago, asking what Catherine would have said about various problems as if her mother's wisdom could be summoned through memory. She used to say that if you're not sure what to do the thing you'll be able to live with afterward. The thing that lets you look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. Sophie considered this with the seriousness that she brought to all important questions. So you have to figure out which choice lets you look at yourself in the mirror. That's the idea. What if both choices are bad? Then you pick the one that's less bad or the one that's bad for the right reasons. Sophie returned to her homework, apparently satisfied with this answer, and Daniel sat with her until the work was done and bedtime had come and the apartment was quiet except for the sounds of the city beyond the windows. Margaret came by later ostensibly to return a pan she had borrowed, but actually to check on her son. Sophie says you have been sad. I'm not sad. I'm in limbo. What happened with the Sterling woman? Daniel told her sitting at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many difficult conversations over the years. He told her about the documents and the confrontation and the suspension of his consulting contract. He told her about Victoria's anger and his admission and the uncertainty that hung over everything now. Margaret listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You told her the truth. Eventually. Not soon enough. But you told her, and you told her you loved her. Daniel winced slightly at the words spoken aloud. I said I was falling in love with her, which might have been presumptuous given the circumstances. Was it true? Yes. Then it wasn't presumptuous. It was honest. Margaret reached across the table to take his hand. Daniel, your father and I were married for 40 years. You want to know the secret of how we stayed together that long? I assumed it was your legendary stubbornness. Partly, but mostly it was this: we never lied to each other. Not about the big things, not about the small things. We disagreed plenty, fought sometimes, drove each other crazy more often than either of us wanted to admit. But we always knew that whatever the other person said was true, even when the truth was hard to hear. Victoria doesn't know if she can trust me. After what I kept from her, I'm not sure she should. Lust isn't something you earn once and then have forever. It's something you build over time through actions and choices and showing up when it matters. Margaret squeezed his hand. You can't control what she decides to do. You can only control what you do. So do the things that are worthy of trust and hope that eventually she sees them. Daniel nodded, taking what comfort he could from his mother's practical wisdom. And in the meantime, you take care of your daughter and do your job and wait. The universe has a way of sorting these things out, even when we can't see how. Margaret left and Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, thinking about trust and truth and the complicated web of consequences that followed every choice. He had done what he could do, told the truth when it mattered, even though the timing had been wrong, offered his heart, even though it might be rejected. Whatever came next was out of his hands. The phone call came a week later when Daniel had almost convinced himself that the silence meant the end. Victoria's voice was different than he remembered, lacking the armor of professional precision, but also lacking the raw anger of their last conversation. I need to see you. Can you come to my apartment tonight, 8 o'clock? Daniel hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Margaret arrived at 6 to stay with Sophie, and Daniel dressed in the only suit he owned and took the subway into Manhattan, emerging from the station into the early evening light of the Upper East Side. The buildings here were different from Queens, taller and cleaner, and designed to project the particular kind of wealth that wanted to be noticed. Victoria's building was on Park Avenue, a pre-war construction that radiated quiet money and centuries of accumulated privilege. The doorman directed him to a private elevator that opened directly into Victoria's apartment, and Daniel rode up 50 floors with his heart beating faster than the situation probably warranted. Victoria was waiting when the doors opened, dressed in clothes he had never seen her wear before. Jeans and a sweater that made her look younger and less guarded than the woman who commanded boardrooms and terrified executives. Thank you for coming. Thank you for calling. They stood awkwardly for a moment, the silence between them heavy with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. Then Victoria gestured toward the interior of the apartment. I have wine and information. I thought we could discuss both. Daniel followed her into a living room that could have graced the cover of an architecture magazine, and all clean lines and expensive furniture and windows that offered a view of Central Park that most people only saw in photographs. Victoria poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one, then sat on a couch that looked like it cost more than his annual salary. I've spent the past week investigating my father's involvement with Meridian Capital, using resources that you don't have access to, talking to people who were there who knew what was happening. Daniel sat down in a chair across from her, holding his wine without drinking it. What did you find? My father was not innocent. Victoria's voice was steady, but Daniel could see what it cost her to say the words. He signed documents he should have read more carefully. He approved recommendations he should have questioned. He was part of a system that defrauded thousands of people, even if he didn't fully understand what he was participating in. I'm sorry. Don't be, the truth is what it is. Victoria took a sip of her wine. But I also found something else. Something that changes the picture somewhat. What? My father resigned from Meridian's advisory board 6 months before he died. He sent a letter to Marcus Blackwell explaining his concerns about certain financial irregularities and recommending a full internal audit. The letter was never acted upon, and all copies were supposed to have been destroyed. Daniel leaned forward, his professional instincts awakening despite the personal circumstances. Blackwell, I've heard that name. He's on your board of directors. He's the chairman of the board, has been since before my father died. Victoria's expression hardened. And according to what I've found, he was far more involved in Meridian's fraud than my father ever was. He not only knew about the shell companies, he profited from them directly. He continued to profit from them for 2 years after the supposed cleanup. Your father tried to stop it. It appears so. He tried and he failed, and shortly after sending that letter, he died of a sudden heart attack. Victoria met Daniel's eyes. The timing might be coincidental, or it might not be. The implications of what she was suggesting hung in the air between them, dark and terrible. You think Blackwell might have been involved in your father's death? I don't know what to think. I don't have enough evidence to make an accusation like that. But I know that Blackwell has been watching me closely since I took over. The company has been positioning himself to take control, If I falter, has done everything possible to ensure that certain secrets stay buried. Daniel set down his wine glass, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. He sent you the documents. The anonymous package with the information about your father. That was Blackwell trying to destabilize you. Almost certainly, he's been threatened by your presence since you started consulting. He sees you as a risk, someone who might dig up the past and discover things he'd prefer to keep hidden. Victoria paused. What he doesn't know is that by trying to use my father's involvement against me, he's revealed far more about himself than he intended. What are you going to do? Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the park spread below like a dark rectangle in the middle of the glittering city. I'm going to fight him. With everything I have, I'm going to expose what he did, what he's still doing, and I'm going to make sure that the people who were hurt by Meridian's fraud finally get some measure of justice. She turned to face Daniel. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands the financial side, who knows how these schemes work and how to prove them. I need someone who isn't afraid of the consequences. You need me. Yes, I need you. Victoria crossed the room to stand in front of him, closer than she had been since before everything fell apart. And I need to know if you're willing to help, knowing what it might cost, knowing the enemies it will make, knowing that Blackwell has resources and connections that make the people who destroyed you before look like amateurs. Daniel looked up at her, at this woman who had every reason to distrust him and was choosing to trust him anyway. At the daughter of a man who had been complicit in his destruction, asking him to help her destroy the system that had protected that complicity. He thought about Catherine, about the principles she had believed in, and the price she had paid for his adherence to them. He thought about Sophie, about the world he wanted her to grow up in, a world where truth mattered and corruption could be challenged, and people like Blackwell could not hide behind money and power forever. I'm in. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm in. Victoria's face softened and she reached out to take his hand. I need you to know something else. Something that has nothing to do with Blackwell or the documents or any of this. What? I've spent the past week being angry at you for not telling me sooner, for letting me develop feelings for you while you were keeping secrets that you knew would hurt me. She paused, tightening her grip on his hand. But I've also spent the past week realizing that the anger doesn't change what I feel. Doesn't change the fact that you're the first person in years who has made me feel like something other than a machine designed to make money and prove my father wrong. Daniel stood, bringing them face to face, close enough that he could see the vulnerability in her eyes that matched the vulnerability in his own heart. I should have told you sooner. I was wrong to keep it from you, whatever my reasons were, and I'm sorry for the pain that caused. I know, I believe you. And for what it's worth, I'm not falling in love with you anymore. Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt. What do you mean? I mean, I've already fallen. Completely. Inconveniently. In ways that scare me because I know what it costs to love someone this much. Victoria smiled, and the smile transformed her face the way it always did, making her look younger and less armored, and like someone who had remembered after a long time, forgetting that it was possible to be happy. That's the worst declaration of love I've ever heard. I'm an analyst, not a poet. Clearly. She kissed him then, and Daniel let himself believe for the first time since Catherine's death that he might be allowed to have this. Happiness. Connection. The terrifying vulnerability of caring about someone who had the power to break him. Whatever came next, whatever Blackwell threw at them, whatever consequences followed from the choices they were making, they would face it together. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The surveillance footage played on a loop in the private office on the 45th floor, casting pale light across Marcus Blackwell's face as he watched Daniel Hayes exit Victoria Sterling's apartment building at 11:30 in the evening. The timestamp in the corner of the screen confirmed what Blackwell had suspected for weeks. The relationship between the CEO and her consultant had evolved beyond the professional boundaries that might have made it manageable. Raymond Cross stood behind him, the attorney's reflection visible in the darkened window that overlooked Manhattan's glittering skyline. They were together for over 3 hours. Our source in the building confirms she hasn't had a personal visitor in the 18 months since she moved in. Blackwell did not respond immediately. He was calculating the way he always calculated, measuring risks against opportunities, and searching for the leverage that would allow him to control an increasingly dangerous situation. The documents I sent her should have driven them apart, should have made her see Hayes as a threat rather than an ally. It appears to have had the opposite effect. Our analysts believe she's now investigating her father's involvement with Meridian more thoroughly than she would have without the provocation, which means she'll eventually find the connection to me. If she hasn't already. Blackwell rose from his chair and walked to the window, his reflection superimposed over the city he had spent 30 years learning to manipulate. He was 62 years old, and he had survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser men, navigated transitions of power that had claimed countless casualties, built a network of influence that extended into every corner of the financial industry. He had not accomplished all of this by being careless or by underestimating his opponents. Victoria Sterling was not her father. Harrison had been brilliant, but ultimately soft, unwilling to do what was necessary when the stakes were highest. His daughter had inherited his intelligence without his weakness, and that made her far more dangerous than he had ever been. We need to accelerate our timeline. The board meeting is in 6 weeks. If we can manufacture enough instability before then, enough questions about her judgment and her associations, we might be able to force a vote of no confidence. And if that fails, Blackwell turned from the window, and his face in the dim light held none of the benevolent authority he showed to the world. Then we'll need to consider more direct measures. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in corporate warfare fought in boardrooms and back channels, in the quiet spaces where real power was exercised. Victoria moved first, restructuring her executive team to isolate the allies Blackwell had cultivated over the years. Mark Sullivan found himself reassigned to a subsidiary office in Chicago, his protests falling on ears that had stopped listening. 2 other department heads who had been feeding information to Blackwell discovered that their budgets had been cut and their responsibilities redistributed to people whose loyalty Victoria had personally verified. Daniel worked alongside her, applying the same forensic attention to corporate politics that he had once applied to financial fraud. He mapped the networks of influence that Blackwell had built, identified the pressure points that could be exploited, and helped Victoria understand which of her remaining executives could be trusted and which were still reporting to the chairman. They worked late into the night, surrounded by documents and spreadsheets and the accumulated evidence of decades of corruption. The investigation into Meridian Capital had expanded beyond Harrison Sterling's involvement, revealing a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that connected Blackwell to fraud on a scale that dwarfed anything Daniel had discovered during his original whistleblower complaint. "He's been doing this for years," Victoria said one evening, staring at a diagram that traced money flows through a dozen different jurisdictions. Siphoning funds through companies that exist only on paper, hiding the proceeds in accounts that can't be traced back to him. The structure is sophisticated. Whoever designed it knew exactly how to exploit the gaps in regulatory oversight. Can we prove it in a way that would hold up in court? Daniel considered the question carefully, weighing the evidence they had gathered against the standard that would be required to bring criminal charges. We can prove enough to raise serious questions. Enough to justify a formal investigation by the SEC or the Department of Justice. But Blackwell has resources we don't have. Lawyers who specialize in making evidence disappear. Connections to people who can influence which cases get pursued and which get quietly dropped. Like what happened to your case. Exactly like what happened to my case. Victoria was quiet for a moment, processing this reality with the pragmatic attention she brought to every problem. Then we need to find another way. Something that doesn't depend on the system working the way it's supposed to. The answer came from an unexpected source on an afternoon when the spring sun was streaming through the windows of Victoria's office and the city below seemed almost peaceful. Helen Marsh appeared at the door, her expression suggesting she had something important to share and was uncertain whether she should share it. The HR director was 55 years old with silver hair and the kind of face that had weathered everything life could throw at it, and she had worked for Sterling Financial since Harrison Sterling's time. "Miss Sterling, I need to speak with you privately about your father." Victoria gestured for her to enter, and Daniel moved to leave, but Helen stopped him with a raised hand. "You should stay, Mr. Hayes. What I have to say concerns you as well." She closed the door behind her and crossed to the desk, pulling a USB drive from her pocket and placing it on the surface between them. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this." Your father entrusted it to me before he died with instructions to pass it along to someone I trusted if anything happened to him. Victoria stared at the small device as if it might explode. What's on it? Everything Harrison gathered about Marcus Blackwell's involvement with Meridian Capital. Emails, financial records, internal communications that prove Blackwell knew about the fraud and profited from it. Your father was building a case against him when he died. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, the implications of what Helen was describing, reshaping everything he thought he understood about the situation. Harrison was investigating Blackwell for almost a year before his heart attack. He discovered the same things you've been discovering, Mr. Hayes, but he made the mistake of confronting Blackwell directly instead of going to the authorities. Helen's voice carried a weight of grief that suggested she had been carrying this secret for far too long. The last time I spoke to him, he told me he was planning to resign from Meridian's advisory board and take everything he knew to the SEC. 3 days later, he was dead. Victoria's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as if she needed the solid surface to keep herself upright. You think Blackwell killed my father? I think the timing was suspicious. I think Harrison was afraid of something in those final weeks, looking over his shoulder in ways he never had before. And I think Blackwell had both the motive and the means to ensure that your father's investigation never reached its conclusion. The silence that followed was thick with implications, with the weight of secrets finally being revealed and the terrible possibility that Harrison Sterling's death had been something other than natural. Why didn't you come forward before? Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Why wait 5 years to tell me this? Because I was afraid. Because Blackwell has eyes everywhere, and I knew what happened to people who crossed him. Because I wanted to believe that with Harrison gone, the danger had passed, and I could keep my head down and survive until retirement. Helen met Victoria's eyes directly. But then you hired Mr. Kim. Hayes and I started to hope that maybe finally someone would be willing to fight back. Daniel picked up the USB drive, turning it over in his hands as if he could read its contents through the plastic casing. This changes everything. If the evidence on here is as comprehensive as you're suggesting, we might actually be able to bring Blackwell down. It's comprehensive. Harrison was meticulous about documentation. He knew what would be required to make a case stick, and he gathered everything he could before Blackwell realized what he was doing. Victoria stood abruptly, walking to the window with her back to them, and Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the struggle to process everything she was learning about the father she had spent 5 years trying to live up to. He wasn't complicit. All this time, I thought he had been part of the fraud, that everything I inherited was built on corruption. But he was trying to stop it. He made mistakes. He should have been more careful about what he signed, should have asked more questions before lending his name to things he didn't fully understand. But when he realized what was happening, he tried to make it right. Helen's voice softened. He loved you, Victoria. Everything he did in those final months was about protecting you, about ensuring that when the truth came out, you wouldn't be implicated in his mistakes. Victoria turned from the window, and her face held something Daniel had never seen there before. Not the cold precision of the CEO or the vulnerability of the woman he had come to love. Something fiercer. Something that looked like the beginning of a war. Then we finish what he started. We take everything he gathered and everything we found, and we burn Marcus Blackwell to the ground. The journalist's name was Thomas Webb, and he had spent 2 years building a case that would expose the full scope of the Meridian Capital fraud. Daniel met him at a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan, a deliberate choice of neutral territory that signaled neither trust nor suspicion. Webb was 45 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades chasing stories that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and his eyes held the particular sharpness of a mind that missed nothing and forgot even less. Daniel Hayes, the whistleblower who got destroyed for telling the truth. Webb stirred his coffee without looking up. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. And I've been avoiding journalists for 3 years. Funny how circumstances change. Circumstance meaning Victoria Sterling, meaning the evidence you've apparently been gathering about Marcus Blackwell's involvement with Meridian. Webb finally met Daniel's eyes. I have sources inside Sterling, financial, not as many as I'd like, but enough to know that something significant is happening. What do you want? The same thing you want. The truth documented and verified and published in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed. The full story of what happened at Meridian, who was responsible, and who covered it up. Daniel considered the man across from him, weighing the risks of collaboration against the potential benefits. Webb had resources that Daniel and Victoria lacked, connections to other journalists and investigators who could amplify whatever evidence they provided. But he also had his own agenda, his own priorities, and there was no guarantee that his interests would align with theirs. If I give you what we have, how do I know you won't publish something that destroys Victoria, along with Blackwell? Her father's name is on some of those documents. Because I'm not interested in destroying innocent people. I'm interested in the truth, and the truth is that Harrison Sterling was trying to stop the fraud when he died. That's a very different story than the one Blackwell has been trying to tell. You know about that? I know more than you might think, including the fact that Blackwell has been feeding information to certain media outlets, trying to shape the narrative in a way that protects himself while making Harrison look like the primary villain. Webb leaned forward. I can help you control how this story gets told, or you can take your chances with journalists who don't have the full picture and might draw conclusions that hurt Victoria more than they hurt Blackwell. Daniel thought about Catherine, about the way the media had portrayed him during the original whistleblower case, the headlines that had painted him as a disgruntled employee rather than someone trying to protect innocent people from fraud. He thought about Sophie, about the questions she would ask someday about why her father had been destroyed for telling the truth. I need to discuss this with Victoria. It's not my decision to make alone. Of course, but don't take too long. Blackwell is accelerating his own timeline. My sources suggest he's planning something for the board meeting in 5 weeks, and whatever it is, it won't be good for your side. The conversation with Victoria happened that evening in her apartment, with the city glittering beyond the windows and the weight of everything they had learned pressing down on them. Webb is right about one thing. We can't control this story if we try to keep it contained within the company. Blackwell has too many allies on the board, too many connections in the industry. If we try to take him down through internal channels, he'll find a way to turn it against us. So we go public, give Webb everything we have, and hope that the exposure is enough to force the authorities to act. It's risky. Once the story is out there, we lose control of how it develops. Other journalists will dig into things we might prefer to keep private. The company's reputation will take a hit, at least in the short term. Victoria walked to the window, a habit Daniel had come to recognize as her way of thinking through difficult problems. My father spent a year building a case against Blackwell, and he died before he could use it. I don't want to make the same mistake. I don't want to wait until the perfect moment and discover that the perfect moment never comes. So we move forward. We give Webb enough to start publishing, and we prepare for whatever Blackwell throws at us in response. Daniel crossed the room to stand beside her, their reflections visible in the dark glass against the backdrop of the city. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Blackwell won't go down without a fight, and he has resources we can't match. I know. And there's no guarantee we'll win. Even with everything we have, even with Webb on our side, the system has a way of protecting people like Blackwell. Victoria turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that had not been there when they first met. A certainty that went beyond professional confidence, beyond the armor she wore to survive in a world that wanted to see her fail. My father tried to do the right thing, and it killed him. If I don't finish what he started, his death means nothing. All the years I spent trying to prove myself to a man I thought didn't believe in me, and it turns out he was trying to protect me all along. Her voice caught slightly. I owe him this. I owe myself this. And I owe it to everyone who was hurt by what Blackwell did. Then we fight. The counterattack came faster than they had anticipated on a Wednesday morning that had seemed no different from any other. Victoria arrived at her office to find Marcus Blackwell waiting for her, seated in the chair behind her desk, as if he owned the space. His expression held the particular satisfaction of someone who believed he had already won. Victoria, I think it's time we had a frank conversation about the future of this company. Get out of my chair, Marcus. In a moment. First, I want to show you something. He slid a folder across the desk. Photographs of you and Daniel Hayes entering your apartment building together. Leaving together the next morning. The timestamps make the nature of your relationship quite clear. Victoria did not touch the folder, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. My personal life is none of your business. It becomes my business when it affects the company. When the CEO is romantically involved with a man who was fired for making fraudulent claims against his former employer, who has been blacklisted from every reputable firm in the industry, who spent the last 3 years cleaning toilets in this very building. Blackwell stood buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision. The board will be very interested in these photographs, as will the financial press. Is that supposed to frighten me? It should, because I'm not just going to show them the photographs. I'm going to show them evidence that you've been using company resources to conduct a personal vendetta against me. That you've been conspiring with Hayes to fabricate accusations designed to force me off the board. That you've allowed your judgment to be compromised by an inappropriate relationship with a man who has every reason to want revenge against anyone associated with the Meridian Capital. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her, the careful plans she and Daniel had been building suddenly looking far less solid than they had seemed. None of that is true. Truth is remarkably flexible, Victoria. You should know that by now. The question isn't what's true. The question is what people can be made to believe. Blackwell moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. The board meeting is in 4 weeks. I suggest you spend that time preparing your resignation, because one way or another you won't be CEO when it's over. He left and Victoria stood alone in her office, surrounded by the empire her father had built, and she had fought to preserve, feeling, for the first time, that she might actually lose. The emergency meeting happened that evening in Daniel's Queen's apartment because Victoria's building was no longer safe for sensitive conversations. Sophie was at a sleepover, Margaret watching from the apartment upstairs, with the particular vigilance of a mother who knew her son was in trouble. Victoria sat at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many difficult conversations over the years, her professional armor stripped away to reveal the frightened woman underneath. He has photographs. He has a narrative. And he has 4 weeks to convince enough board members that I'm unfit to lead. We have evidence too. Helen's files, everything we've gathered, Webb's investigation. But we're not ready to go public yet. Webb needs more time to verify everything to build a story that can't be easily dismissed. If we rush it, Blackwell's lawyers will tear it apart. Daniel paced the small kitchen, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Then we need to buy time. Find a way to delay the board meeting, or at least delay whatever vote Blackwell is planning. How he controls the agenda. He has enough allies on the board to push through whatever he wants. Not if we can turn some of those allies. Not if we can show them that siding with Blackwell is more dangerous than siding with you. Victoria looked up at him, a spark of hope visible in her exhausted eyes. You have an idea. I have the beginning of an idea, but it's risky and it might not work. At this point, I'll take risky over certain defeat. Daniel sat down across from her, reaching for her hands across the table. Blackwell's power depends on secrecy, on people not knowing what he's done or being too afraid to act on what they suspect. But fear only works as long as people believe he's going to win. If we can create doubt, if we can make the board members question whether backing him is really in their best interest. We show them enough of what we have to scare them. Not everything, not yet, but enough to make them think twice. Exactly. We don't need to convince them that Blackwell is guilty. We just need to convince them that supporting him might make them complicit in whatever comes next. Victoria was quiet for a moment, processing the strategy with the analytical precision that had made her successful in a world designed to see her fail. It could work. Some of them are cowards who will side with whoever seems most likely to win. If we can shift their perception of the odds, then we might be able to survive long enough for Webb to finish his investigation and publish the full story. And if it doesn't work, Daniel squeezed her hands, holding on to her the way he wished someone had held on to him during the darkest days after Catherine's death. Then we go down fighting. We take everything we have to the SEC, to the Department of Justice, to every journalist who will listen. We make so much noise that Blackwell can't silence us the way he silenced your father. Victoria leaned across the table and kissed him, a gesture that contained everything she couldn't say in words. Gratitude, fear, love, the desperate hope of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. Whatever happens, I'm glad I found you. I'm glad you spoke up that night in the conference room instead of staying invisible. I'm glad too, even if it costs us everything. especially if it costs us everything, because some things are worth the price. They sat together in the small kitchen of a queen's apartment, two people who had lost so much and found each other in the wreckage preparing for a battle that would determine the course of their lives. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, they made their plans and held their hope and waited for the storm that was coming. The next 4 weeks would decide everything, and whatever happened, they would face it together. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the kind of gray sky that seemed to press down on Manhattan, like a physical weight clouds hanging low over the towers of glass and steel that defined the city's skyline. Victoria Sterling stood at the window of her apartment, watching the first commuters emerge onto the streets below, and felt the particular calm that comes when you have done everything possible and must now trust the outcome to forces beyond your control. Daniel stood behind her, his reflection visible in the glass, and she could see the tension in his shoulders that matched the tension in her own body. They had spent the past 4 weeks preparing for this day, building alliances and gathering evidence and positioning themselves for a confrontation that would determine the future of everything they had fought for. Webb's article goes live at noon, Daniel said. Time to hit while the board meeting is in progress. By the time Blackwell realizes what's happening, the story will already be spreading. And the SEC? Helen's contact confirmed they received the full package yesterday. They're not committing to anything official, but she says there's significant interest at the enforcement level. Victoria turned from the window, and in the early morning light, her face held something that Daniel had come to recognize over the months of their partnership. Not confidence exactly, but the determination of someone who had accepted the risk and chosen to move forward regardless. Whatever happens today, I want you to know something. What? My father spent his whole life building things. The company, his reputation, the legacy he thought he was leaving behind. And in the end, none of it protected him from the consequences of trusting the wrong people. She crossed the room to stand in front of Daniel, close enough that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible pressures. But he also spent his last months trying to do the right thing, trying to expose the corruption he had been part of, even knowing what it might cost him. That's the legacy I want to honor. Not the buildings or the money or the reputation. The choice to fight for something that matters. Daniel reached out and took her hand, feeling the slight tremor that she was working so hard to conceal. He would be proud of you. Whatever he said before he died, whatever doubts he expressed, he would be proud of the woman you've become. I hope so. I hope that wherever he is, he can see that his daughter didn't give up, that she finished what he started. They stood together in the quiet of the apartment, drawing strength from each other's presence until the time came to leave for the battle that awaited them. The boardroom on the 48th floor of Sterling Financial had been designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its massive table of polished mahogany and its walls lined with portraits of the company's founders and most successful executives. Harrison Sterling's portrait hung in the place of honor, his painted eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings with an expression that could be interpreted as either approval or judgment. Victoria entered the room at exactly 9 o'clock. Her posture straight and her expression composed, showing nothing of the fear that churned beneath her professional armor. The board members were already seated, 12 faces that ranged from openly hostile to carefully neutral to the few allies she had managed to cultivate over the past weeks. Marcus Blackwell sat at the far end of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression radiating the benevolent authority that had fooled so many people for so long. He rose as Victoria entered, a gesture of false courtesy that fooled no one. Victoria, thank you for joining us. I believe we have some important matters to discuss. Indeed we do, Marcus, though I suspect the matters I want to discuss are different from the ones you had planned. She took her seat at the head of the table, the position that was hers by right as CEO, and felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The moment that would determine whether her father's sacrifice had been in vain or whether his legacy would finally be redeemed. Blackwell wasted no time on preliminaries. He had spent 4 weeks building his case, and he was eager to deliver the killing blow. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I've called this meeting to address a matter of grave concern regarding our CEO's judgment and conduct. As you know, Victoria has been engaged in a personal relationship with a man named Daniel Hayes, a former financial analyst who was terminated from Meridian Capital Partners for making fraudulent claims against his employer. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air, watching the faces of the board members for signs of the reaction he expected. What you may not know is that Hayes has been using his access to our company to conduct an unauthorized investigation into matters that have no bearing on Sterling Financial's operations. He has been gathering information, making accusations, and influencing our CEO's decisions in ways that serve his personal vendetta rather than the interests of our shareholders. Victoria listened to the familiar litany of charges, the narrative that Blackwell had been crafting since the moment he realized she was a threat to his carefully constructed empire of lies. She had heard it all before in the private conversations, and the whispered warnings, and the anonymous leaks to financial journalists who were only too happy to print accusations without verification. But she had also spent 4 weeks preparing her response, and she was not the same woman who had inherited this company 5 years ago, uncertain of her place and desperate to prove herself to a father who was no longer alive to see her succeed. "Are you finished, Marcus?" The question was delivered with a calm that seemed to unsettle him, a departure from the defensive posture he had expected. "I have more to say, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to these initial concerns." "How generous of you." Victoria stood, commanding the attention of everyone in the room with the force of her presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus has presented you with a carefully constructed narrative designed to make me look like a woman whose judgment has been compromised by an inappropriate relationship. He wants you to believe that I have been manipulated, that my decisions have been influenced by someone with a personal agenda, that I am unfit to lead this company." She paused, letting her gaze move around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. "What he has not told you is why he is so desperate to remove me from this position. What he has not told you is what he stands to lose if I remain in control of Sterling Financial. And what he has not told you is what he did to my father." The shift in the room was palpable, a sudden tension that suggested Victoria had struck a nerve that Blackwell had not anticipated. "Your father was a valued member of this organization," Blackwell said smoothly. "His death was a tragedy that we all mourned. I don't see what relevance. My father discovered that you were systematically defrauding the clients of Meridian Capital Partners. He gathered evidence, documented your involvement, and was preparing to take everything he knew to the SEC when he died of a sudden heart attack." Victoria's voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of grief and months of investigation. "The timing of his death was remarkably convenient for you, Marcus, almost as if someone wanted to ensure that his investigation never reached its conclusion." The room erupted in murmurs, board members exchanging glances that ranged from shock to suspicion to the dawning realization that they might have been backing the wrong side. Blackwell's composure cracked for the first time, a flash of something dark passing across his face before he recovered his mask of benevolent concern. "These are serious accusations, Victoria. Accusations that you cannot possibly substantiate." "Can't I?" Victoria reached into the folder she had brought with her and withdrew a stack of documents, sliding copies across the table to each board member. "These are emails between my father and Marcus Blackwell, dated 6 months before my father's death. In them, my father explicitly states his concerns about financial irregularities at Meridian Capital and his intention to report them to the authorities. Marcus's responses make clear that he was aware of the fraud and was actively working to conceal it." The board members began reading their faces, reflecting the growing understanding that the situation was far more complex than Blackwell had led them to believe. "I also have documentation showing that Marcus continued to profit from the Meridian fraud for 2 years after my father's death, using shell companies and offshore accounts to hide the proceeds." Victoria's voice grew stronger with each revelation. "He used his position on this board to ensure that no one looked too closely at the connection between Sterling Financial and Meridian Capital. He cultivated allies and silenced critics and built a network of influence designed to protect himself at the expense of everyone else." Blackwell stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the boardroom. "This is absurd. These documents are fabrications created by Hayes to support his vendetta against everyone associated with Meridian. Victoria has been manipulated by a man who has every reason to want revenge, and she's too blinded by her personal feelings to see it. The documents are authentic." The voice came from the doorway, and every head in the room turned to see Daniel Hayes entering the boardroom, followed by two people in dark suits whose bearing immediately identified them as federal investigators. I should know. I've spent 3 years studying every aspect of the Meridian fraud, and I can verify that everything Victoria has presented is genuine. Blackwell's face went pale, the color draining from his features as he recognized the implications of what was happening. You have no right to be here. Security. Security has been informed that federal investigators are conducting official business on these premises, Daniel said calmly. I suggest you save your objections for your attorneys, Marcus. You're going to need them. The lead investigator stepped forward, her credentials already in hand. Mr. Blackwell, I'm Agent Patricia Reyes with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have some questions about your involvement with Meridian Capital Partners and several related entities. I would appreciate it if you would accompany us voluntarily, but I should inform you that we have the authority to compel your cooperation if necessary. The boardroom had gone completely silent, every person present, understanding that they were witnessing something historic, the collapse of a carefully constructed empire of lies, and the vindication of everyone who had been destroyed by the man now facing federal investigation. Blackwell looked around the room, searching for allies, for support, for any avenue of escape from the trap that had closed around him. He found nothing. The board members who had supported him for years were suddenly very interested in the documents in front of them, unwilling to meet his eyes or offer any gesture of solidarity. This isn't over, he said, his voice carrying a threat that no longer had the power to intimidate. My attorneys will have these charges dismissed within a week. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, Daniel said, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. I've known for 3 years, ever since you and your partners destroyed my career and my family, because I dared to tell the truth about what you were doing. The difference is that now the truth has allies. Now the truth has resources. And now the truth is going to win. Agent Reyes placed a hand on Blackwell's arm, a gesture that was polite but unmistakably firm. Mr. Blackwell, please come with us. They led him from the boardroom, past the portraits of Sterling Financial's founders, past the windows that looked out over the city he had spent decades learning to manipulate, past the table where he had once held court as one of the most powerful men in the financial industry. His exit was quiet, almost anticlimactic, the end of an era that had caused so much damage to so many people. When the door closed behind him, Victoria turned to face the remaining board members, her expression composed, but her eyes bright with the emotion she had been holding back throughout the confrontation. I understand that some of you may have concerns about my leadership, about my judgment, about the decisions I've made over the past several months. I'm prepared to address those concerns openly and honestly. But first, I want to make something clear. She paused, letting her gaze move around the table one final time. My father built this company from nothing. He made mistakes along the way, trusted people he shouldn't have trusted, signed documents he should have read more carefully. But when he realized what was happening, he tried to make it right. He spent the last months of his life gathering evidence and preparing to expose the corruption he had been part of. He died before he could finish what he started, but I am not going to let his sacrifice be in vain. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. There was respect in it and perhaps the beginning of understanding. I propose that we table any discussion of leadership changes until the full scope of Marcus Blackwell's activities has been investigated and the company has had time to assess the implications. In the meantime, I will work with our legal team to ensure that Sterling Financial cooperates fully with federal investigators and takes all necessary steps to distance ourselves from any wrongdoing. The vote that followed was unanimous, a show of support that surprised even Victoria. The board members, who had been Blackwell's allies, were suddenly eager to demonstrate their commitment to transparency and good governance, their survival instincts overriding whatever loyalty they had felt to the man who had just been led away in disgrace. When the meeting adjourned, Victoria stood at the window of the boardroom, looking out at the city that had witnessed her father's rise and fall, and her own journey from uncertain heir to the leader who had finally brought his legacy to completion. Daniel came to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. It's over. Not quite. There will be investigations, legal proceedings, months of work to untangle everything Blackwell was involved in. The company's reputation will take a hit before things get better. But the worst is over. The truth is out, and you're still standing. Victoria turned to face him, and in her expression, Daniel saw something that had not been there when they first met. Peace, the particular calm of someone who had finally laid down a burden they had been carrying for far too long. My father would have liked you. He appreciated people who weren't afraid to speak truth to power, even when power had the ability to destroy them. I'm not sure liking is the word. I pointed out mistakes and challenged assumptions and generally made myself difficult to ignore. Those aren't qualities that endear you to powerful people. They're qualities that matter. The world needs more people who are willing to say what they see, regardless of the consequences. She reached for his hand, holding on to him the way she had learned to hold on over the months of their partnership with the particular grip of someone who had finally found something worth keeping. What happens now? Now we rebuild. We take everything we've learned and we build something better. A company that values truth over profit. A legacy that my father would actually be proud of. And us? Victoria smiled, and the smile transformed her face the way it always did, making her look younger and less armored, and like someone who had remembered after a long time forgetting that it was possible to be happy. Us is the part I'm most certain about. Whatever else changes, whatever challenges we face, that's the foundation I want to build everything else on. They stood together at the window, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of lives that seemed beyond repair, looking out at a city that had tested them and broken them and ultimately given them the chance to become something stronger than they had been before. The months that followed were a study in transformation, the slow and difficult work of turning crisis into opportunity. Victoria restructured Sterling Financial with surgical precision, cutting ties to every venture that could not withstand ethical scrutiny and every relationship that had been tainted by Blackwell's influence. The company's profits dropped initially as she had predicted, and there were shareholders who grumbled and analysts who questioned whether she was sacrificing financial performance for moral posturing. But slowly something changed. New clients began to appear. People who had heard about the CEO who had exposed corruption rather than covering it up, who wanted their money managed by someone they could trust. Impact investors took notice. The financial press that had once dismissed Victoria as her father's inexperienced heir now wrote about her as a pioneer of ethical capitalism. Daniel, no longer employed by Sterling Financial, started something new. He registered as an independent financial advisor, taking on clients that the established firms ignored, immigrants and single parents, and people who had been burned by the system that had once employed him. He taught night classes at a community college in Queens, explaining compound interest and investment strategies to students who worked during the day and came to class exhausted but hopeful. Sophie adapted to the changes with the resilience of childhood, accepting Victoria's presence in their lives with the matter-of-fact pragmatism of a 7-year-old who had already learned that families came in many forms. She called Victoria by her first name for the first few months, then gradually shifted to something warmer. Something that acknowledged the bond that was forming without trying to replace the mother she still remembered. Margaret watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had surveyed enough hardship to recognize when something good was taking root. The Sterling Hayes Foundation launched on a gray Tuesday morning in a renovated building in Brooklyn that had once been a warehouse and was now a center for financial education and whistleblower support. The opening ceremony was small, just the people who had helped make it possible, but the impact would grow over the years to come. Daniel taught the first class himself, standing in front of 15 students who had come from backgrounds as varied as his own journey from Wharton to Wall Street to a janitor's closet in a building he now entered as a partner rather than an employee. I'm not going to promise that learning about finance will make you rich. The system is still stacked against people like us, and there are forces in this world that don't want you to understand how money really works. He paused, looking around the room at faces that held skepticism and hope in equal measure. But knowledge is power, not the power to control others, but the power to protect yourself, to see through the lies that people tell when they want to take what's yours, to make decisions based on understanding rather than fear. After the class, a man approached him, older and weathered, and carrying the particular weight of someone who had lost more than he could easily name. Mr. Hayes, I wanted to say something. I lost everything in the Meridian collapse. My retirement fund, my daughter's college savings, 20 years of work that just disappeared into accounts I'll never see. The man's voice cracked slightly. I read about what you did. how you tried to stop it, how they destroyed you for speaking up. I wanted to say thank you. Someone fought for people like me. That matters. Daniel stood very still as the man walked away, feeling something shift in his chest that had been locked tight for 3 years. Victoria found him later standing alone in the empty classroom with the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Everything okay? Someone thanked me today for the whistleblower case, for trying to stop what Meridian was doing. He turned to face her and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I spent 3 years thinking that Kate died for nothing, that speaking up was pointless, that the system won and I lost and nothing I did made any difference. And now I think maybe she'd be proud. Maybe it mattered after all. Maybe the point isn't whether you win or lose. Maybe the point is just that you tried. Victoria crossed the room and put her arms around him, holding on the way they had learned to hold on to each other through everything that had happened. She would be proud. I never met her, but I know she would be proud of the man you've become, the father Sophie has, the partner I have. They stood together in the classroom that represented everything they were trying to build, surrounded by empty chairs that would soon be filled with people seeking the knowledge that could change their lives. The anniversary came faster than either of them expected, a year since the board meeting that had changed everything. They celebrated quietly, just the 4 of them in the Queen's apartment that had witnessed so much grief and had now become the foundation of something new. Sophie had made a cake with Margaret's help, chocolate with slightly uneven frosting that she had applied herself. Daniel had hung streamers that drooped in places, and Victoria had brought flowers that didn't quite match the color scheme anyone had imagined. It was imperfect and chaotic and exactly what a family celebration should be. "Dad," Sophie said, her voice carrying the particular seriousness that meant she was about to ask something important. "Are you happy?" Daniel looked around the small kitchen at the woman he loved and the daughter he would do anything to protect, and the mother who had held them all together through the darkest times. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm happy. Really happy. Not just pretending. Really happy. The kind of happy that sneaks up on you when you're not looking and makes you realize that maybe everything you went through was worth it because it brought you here." Sophie considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old who had learned young that life did not always go the way you hoped. "Mom would be glad. She always wanted you to be happy." "I know she did. And I think wherever she is, she can see that we're okay, that we found our way to something good." Later, after Sophie was asleep and Margaret had gone upstairs to her own apartment, Daniel and Victoria sat on the small balcony that overlooked the Queen Street, where their life together had taken root. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked. "The choices that brought us here, the price you paid for telling the truth." Daniel thought about the question, about the years of struggle and loss and the slow rebuilding that had followed. "I regret that Kate died. I'll always regret that. I regret that Sophie had to grow up without her mother. I regret the years I spent invisible, hiding from a world that had hurt me." He paused, searching for the words that would capture something he had only recently begun to understand. "But I don't regret speaking up. I don't regret being the kind of person who can't stay quiet when something is wrong. Because that's the person Kate fell in love with. That's the person I want Sophie to see when she looks at her father. And that's the person who was able to recognize something real when he found it." Victoria leaned against his shoulder, her body warm against his in the cool night air. "My father used to say that success was about winning, about being stronger and smarter and more ruthless than everyone else, about building something that would last and not caring who you had to destroy to do it. And now I think he was wrong. Success isn't about winning, it's about becoming someone you can live with. Someone who does the right thing even when it costs you. Someone who builds things that matter, not just things that last." They sat together as the city hummed around them, 2 people who had lost so much and found each other in the wreckage, watching the lights of Manhattan glitter in the distance and feeling the particular peace that comes when you have finally arrived at a place that feels like home. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and challenging, and full of possibilities they could not yet imagine. There would be setbacks and struggles and days when the weight of everything they were trying to build would seem too heavy to bear, but they would face it together. That was the foundation that mattered. That was the truth that would carry them through. Daniel thought about his father working the docks for 40 years without ever hanging his head. He thought about his mother surviving loss after loss and emerging with her dignity intact. He thought about Kate believing in him even when he couldn't believe in himself, teaching him that some things were worth the price you paid for them. And he thought about Sophie asleep in the next room, with her whole life ahead of her, growing up in a world that was still imperfect, but that her father was helping to make a little bit better. "I love you," he said, the words simple and insufficient and exactly right. "I know," Victoria replied, smiling in the darkness. "I love you too." They sat together until the night grew cold and the city quieted, and the stars appeared above the glow of the streetlights, two people who had learned that the hardest journeys sometimes lead to the best destinations. And when they finally went inside, closing the door on the night and the past and everything that had brought them to this moment, they did so knowing that whatever came next, they would face it the way they had faced everything else. Together, with truth, with love, with the quiet certainty that some things are worth fighting for no matter what they cost.